Good morning. Our director, Sasha Perugini, is in Rome for an important meeting, so can't be with us today. She normally does the welcome, but she has recorded some words for us. And so we will begin the symposium as tradition with her welcome to you.
Benvenute, benvenuti. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our annual prestigious appointment with the Graduate Symposium in Italian Renaissance Art. My name is Sasha Perugini, and I'm the director of Syracuse University abroad in Florence, in this role since 2011. Today's event is one of the highlights of our academic calendar, a rooted tradition that stretches back 58 years. Our master's program, in fact, opened in 1964, just 5 years after Syracuse University launched its Florence program here in the Villa Rossa in 1959. We will soon be celebrating its 60th anniversary. We're immensely proud of the program's distinguished history and international reputation, and it's my true pleasure to welcome you all here today, and by all, I also mean those who are joining us virtually, expanding the audience far beyond this room as we live stream and record this event. It is always a nourishing learning experience to listen to our graduates share their hard-won results of their extensive research. Our master's program is renowned not only for the first-hand investigations conducted by our students in local archives, libraries, museums, and churches, but also for the impressive training they receive on how to communicate their findings most effectively to the general and specialized public. The strength and quality of this program is a credit to the talented scholars guiding the students in their research and symposium preparation, and who will be introduced individually shortly. They're closely operating under the guidance of Dr. Sally Cornelissen, Professor of Art History at our main campus in Syracuse, and director of the Florence Master's Program since 2015, and Professor Molly Bourne, the program's Florence coordinator. Over the decades, many of the graduate students in the Master's Program have been accepted into top-tier PhD programs and have gone on to have distinguished academic careers in art history. Others have pursued advanced degrees in archival research, library sciences, or museum studies. Some of them now teach for us or lead academic site visits for our students. Very often, these alumni return to Florence to visit their professors and their peers who have remained here and are working at cultural institutions throughout the city. All of this is a testament to the rigor and success of this program, and we're always glad to welcome you back every year, whether it be in person or virtually. Thank you all for joining us. I have no doubt you will enjoy this morning's talks, and I would like to pass the podium to Professor Cornelissen now. Thank you.
This is my virtual cue.
Benvenute.
Okay. Good morning. On behalf of Syracuse University's Chancellor, Interim Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and my colleagues in the Department of Art and Music Histories, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 36th Annual Florence Graduate Symposium, the capstone event of the Syracuse Florence Graduate Program in Italian Renaissance Art. The allure, success, and longevity of our unique program lie in its structure, the exceptional caliber of our faculty and students, and the very special opportunity it offers to earn a master's degree in art history with an extended residency in Italy. I'm grateful that the program has emerged mostly unscathed from the COVID-19 pandemic, and relieved that this year's cohort has been spared the difficulties, disruptions, and disappointments the previous two classes of Florence grads had to endure. Our program's focus is early modern Italian art, but we encourage our students to think broadly about the period and the discipline of art history. They engage with the history and practice of art conservation, art historical theories, methods, and historiography, the collection and display of art, the digital humanities, and the ways in which the visual culture of the period relates to larger Mediterranean and global historical and artistic contexts. In recent years, educators have increasingly stressed the need for and benefits of hands-on experiential learning, But that's nothing new to us, as experiential learning has been the cornerstone of our program since its foundation in 1964. Our students regularly engage with leading scholars, museum curators, and works of art and architecture. They learn how to craft gold ground panel paintings, apply plaster and paint to a wall to produce a fresco, handle and transcribe archival documents, conduct original research, and, as you'll see today, prepare and deliver professional presentations. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the graduate faculty who have ably guided them through these experiences, starting with Molly Bourne, the Florence coordinator who, like me, is an alumna of the program. Brian Breggy, Sam Johnson, and Francis Gage taught them during their first semester on the main campus in Syracuse. After their transfer to Florence at the beginning of this year, they continued their coursework with Molly Bourne, Jonathan Nelson, Matteo Duni, Diane Kunzelman, who's also an alumna, Ezio Buzzegoli, and Sean Nelson, another alumnus. I have every confidence that the students whose papers you hear today will follow in the footsteps of our many successful alumni. The latter include Bennett Harrison, who stood at this lectern last year and began Yale University's art history PhD program this fall, and Elaine Ruffalo of the class of 1987, who's sitting right back there, the inaugural year of the Florence Graduate Symposium. Elaine, who lives in Florence and leads tours and teaches art history throughout Italy and online, was recently profiled in the English news magazine, The Florentine. This program transforms the lives, and not just the intellectual lives of those who participate in it. Our students strengthen their foreign language skills and cultural literacy, develop self-sufficiency, and forge the kind of personal and professional creativity and resiliency that lasts a lifetime. It's crucial that we and the university continue to safeguard the rare and special opportunities it offers at a time in which humanities programs is constantly questioned. The value of humanities programs is constantly questioned. We've long benefited from the support of Syracuse University's College of Arts and Sciences, Syracuse Abroad, Syracuse Florence, and the Samuel H. Kress Foundation. Among the generous individual donors who sustain us, I'd like to single out Andrew Razinen, an SU alumnus who studied on the Florence program as an undergraduate and who's here with us today, as well as Carol Bullard, Jack and Jill Laserson, Peter Weller, Mary Gilbert Palmer, Nicole Marca, Barry Katz, Elaine Ruffalo, and Jill Carrington. I extend heartfelt thanks to them and everyone else who has supported our program with both large and small donations. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Molly Bourne. After completing the Syracuse Florence graduate program, Molly earned a PhD in art history at Harvard University. Since taking over as Florence graduate coordinator in 2012, she has guided multiple cohorts of talented students to this capstone event in their graduate careers, maintaining the highest of standards, professional and academic standards with both warmth and compassion. This year was no exception. Please welcome Molly Bourne.
Thank you, Sally. Good morning and welcome. We are delighted you have joined us for the 36th annual Florence Graduate Symposium in Italian Renaissance Art, whether you are with us here at the Villa Rosa or watching via the live broadcast. Before introducing our first speaker, a few brief announcements. The first is for those of you who are physically here today, please ensure that your phones are silent. Second, I would like to thank the many Syracuse Florence staff members who work behind the scenes to make this event possible. Without their dedicated assistance with publicity, technical support, and even the refreshments that those of us who are here in the room today will enjoy, the symposium simply would not be possible. I join Sally in expressing my gratitude to the extraordinary graduate faculty, my colleagues here at Syracuse Florence, Matteo Duni, Ezio Buzzegoli, Diane Kunzelman, Jonathan Nelson, and Sean Nelson, who have taught this group of graduate students with such dedication during the past 11 months, guiding them to this capstone moment. But the true stars of the symposium are the MA candidates who will be presenting their research. Today is your day. Before arriving to Florence last January, these students completed an intensive first semester of coursework in the fall of 2021 at our main campus in Syracuse, New York. During their subsequent year of residency here in Florence, they took 7 graduate seminars here at the Villa Rosa while being introduced to the city's most important artistic monuments and repositories of books and documents related to Italian Renaissance art. Many of their classes were conducted on site in front of original works of art, such as Masaccio's Trinity at Santa Maria Novella, or directly on the scaffolding of the Brancacci Chapel, where they observed from up close the conservation work that is currently underway there. They met with a senior archivist at the Archivio dell'Opera del Duomo and got their feet wet reading original documents at the Florentine State Archives during an introductory course in paleography. They participated in field trips guided by our faculty members to places such as Mantua and Rome, the latter including a special after-hours private visit to the Sistine Chapel. This rich and varied menu of academically rigorous as well as hands-on experiential learning has informed the choice that each student made last spring to define their individual capstone project, the research for which they carried out during the following months. Today, our MA candidates will share the results of their investigations in 15-minute presentations that each make an original contribution to scholarship. The 7 papers you will hear are organized in chronological order according to topic. After the first 3 presentations, those speakers will return to the podium so that the audience members who are physically here in the room can ask them questions using the wireless microphone that my colleague Jonathan Nelson will bring to your seat. There will then be a 25-minute coffee break, after which we will reconvene to hear the last 4 presentations, followed by the opportunity to ask questions of those final speakers. Everyone who is here at the Villa Rossa is then invited to join us for a celebratory brindisi in the room next door. Our first 3 papers explore art and architecture of the 14th and 15th centuries in both Florence and Venice. Our first speaker is Lindsay Hewitt, who will present Incarcerated Art, Andrea Di Cione's expulsion of the Duke of Athens at the Florentine Stinche. Lindsay.
The Expulsion of the Duke of Athens by Andrea Di Cione was one of the first paintings a prisoner would see inside the Stinche, Florence's medieval communal prison. As the prisoner exited the prison's dimly lit interior and entered the bright inner courtyard, the circular fresco, measuring nearly 3 meters in diameter, would have dominated the inmate's visual field. The only extant Trecento painting from inside the Stinche, the Expulsion depicts Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, expelling Walter of Brienne, the Duke of Athens, from Florence in 1343 after his year-long tyrannical reign. Presumably, the Stinche's administration or a government body commissioned Andrea Di Cione to paint the expulsion, though no commissioning documents exist today. 20th century scholars like Frederick Ontal and Samuel Edgerton have focused on the expulsion's iconography, attempting to understand why a communal patron paid to place a fresco in a prison. They argued that the expulsion condemned fraudulent merchants, bankrupts, and debtors, while identifying the prison's inmates with the Duke of Athens. In 2016, George Bent considered the prisoner's perspective, investigating how the expulsion functioned in a punitive space. Bent suggested that the prisoners identified with the Duke's deviance, damnation, and social eviction, while the fresco warned them against future crime. Though prisoners comprise the fresco's intended audience, few scholars have considered the expulsion's impact within this punitive space, and none have defined the social composition of the expulsion's audience. I posit that the economic and political configuration of the Stinche's incarcerated population is crucial for determining the purpose and significance of the fresco to its original viewers. Ultimately, I argue that Andrea Di Cione's expulsion of the Duke of Athens resonated with the newfound civic values of a growing merchant class in Trecento, Florence, by conveying a message that encouraged prisoners to abandon their public social margins and return to its normative center, while simultaneously warning them against the dangers of continued social and criminal deviation. The Stinche opened its single door in 1301 and predominantly functioned as a debtor's prison, incarcerating roughly 600 inmates annually, most of whom were released within their first year of imprisonment. 7 different wards organized the prisoners based on crime and social status. Most of the Stinche's inmates were from the Popolani, the guild participating class that ran Florentine economic and political life. The expulsion was almost certainly commissioned with the Popolani in mind, and the imagery used throughout the fresco would have been particularly poignant to them. Andrea di Cione depicted Walter of Brienne's expulsion from Florence, an event central to Popolani identity and power. The Duke of Athens arrived in Florence to the cheers of the Popolani. Within his first month as temporary viceroy, he estranged his Popolani supporters, however, after allowing minor guilds to participate in the government, effectively disrupting the assumed social order that placed merchants, artisans, and politicians at the center of Florentine civic life. The Duke blundered through his reign for the next year, further ostracizing the Popolani. On July 26, 1343, St. Anne's feast day, the Popolani incited a riot to oust the Duke and return the city to Republican rule. The Duke quickly became an example of fraud and tyranny, and he finds himself condemned for these sins in the expulsion. He stands to St. Anne's left in the traditional position of damned souls in judgment scenes, such as Nardo di Cione's at Santa Maria Novella. Further securing his fate and signifying his rejected state, he holds in his arms a creature that marks his condemned status. Though significant damage makes it nearly illegible today, the Stinche's prisoners would have seen a monster with a man's bearded face, a winged serpentine body, a lion's legs, and a scorpion's tail. Here, Andrea di Cione represented that foul image of fraud from Dante's Inferno, Gerione. In Canto 17, Dante describes Gerione's descent into the 8th circle of hell, where the frauds suffer and receive their punishment. By associating the Duke with Gerione, Andrea di Cione signifies the tyrant's despicable nature and damnation. This visual depiction of the damned Duke aligns with popular sentiment regarding the tyrant. Giovanni Villani, the chronicler of Florentine history, described the Duke's actions by saying, "With deceit and betrayal, he usurped the libertà of the commune and the people of Florence." The Duke appears in the expulsion to symbolize the treachery and deceit that warranted removal from the community. The Duke's image was particularly significant to the merchants, artisans, and politicians that he betrayed. St. Anne was also particularly relevant to the Popolani after the Duke's expulsion on her feast day. St. Anne's perceived role in the restoration of Popolani power propelled her into civic prominence. According to Villani, her feast day was as important as Easter, the resurrection of the Popolani-led city placed on par with Christ's resurrection. Saint Anne became the embodiment of libertà and the savior of Popolani economic and political dominance. Within the expulsion, Saint Anne also assumes the role of civic judge. Backed by a cloth of honor comprised of Florentine civic symbols, she condemns the Duke and casts him from the city on behalf of the Popolani. Yet, like other judgment scenes, while one group faces condemnation to the judge's left, another is blessed and honored. The righteous reside to St. Anne's right, where she passes 3 flags to the body of kneeling soldiers before her. The intended viewers would have recognized these flags as the Popolos, the communes, and the Guelphs, the presiding powers of the Florentine state. By returning the final flag to them, St. Anne symbolically passes the commune and republic back to the Popolani. Though the identity of this body of soldiers is unknown, it is reasonable to presume that they embody the perceived unity of the city's merchants and politicians. With their power and financial stability threatened under the Duke's reign, the Popolani fought to remove the Duke and restore Republican rule. In her role as civic judge, St. Anne accepts these soldiers into Florence, their inclusion demarcated by the Popolo cross stitched across their garments. The soldiers also subtly sport their belonging in unity with the small black T or tau marked on their garments. The tau has a long history as a symbol of holiness and separation in Jewish and Christian traditions. While most art historians have mistaken these as sword scabbards, the Popolani would be familiar with the symbol as a tau cross. The symbol appears most prominently in the Old Testament books of Exodus and Ezekiel, in which the Israelites draw the symbol upon their bodies or belongings to demarcate themselves as God's followers and to escape judgment and death. I suggest that the tau designates the soldiers' belonging and acceptance into the Florentine community. The expulsion features an event central to Popolani identity, a saint with particular importance to merchants and politicians, and an antagonist who betrayed the city's governing class. The expulsion is full of Popolani-specific imagery, and its intended audience at the Stinche hailed from this very class. The Popolani primarily consisted of the guild elites and enfranchised artisans. These men were the most likely to seek liquid capital and loans to run their guilds, and were therefore the most likely citizens to accrue punishable debt. Though debtors' prisons were common throughout Europe and Italy, the Stinche's response to crime was unique for the 14th century, and it informs the expulsion's reception and purpose within a penal institution. According to a 14th century Italian treatise on imprisonment, prison was devised not for punishment, but for the custody of offenders and debtors. Before the Stinche, city and state governments did not consider incarceration a punishment. Instead, imprisonment was a temporary solution to keep social deviants away from mainstream culture until a proper punishment was determined and dealt out. Such punishment typically took the form of corporal harm and public embarrassment, like whipping, amputation, or execution. Most of the Stinche's prisoners, however, received their punishment through incarceration alone. The rise of punitive incarceration in Florence aligns with the increasing power of the guild-based Popolani. Rather than removing a part of the body or harming it, punitive imprisonment stilled the otherwise active body, reducing its libertà. Without freedom of time and movement, the Popolani could not make money or govern their city, making incarceration an acceptable punishment for the otherwise central merchants, artisans, and politicians. Unlike other Tuscan inmates at the time, 86% of the Stinche's prisoners were released within a year of their initial incarceration. Long-term imprisonment within the Stinche was rare, and the released inmates did not face stigmatization after returning to the community center. The Stinche coerced inmates to reform their behavior by restricting their freedom, but the prison did not remove criminals from society. When looking at the expulsion, the prisoners would not immediately identify with the rejected Duke. Unlike him, they were still part of the community and had regular access to it. The prison relied on external support. Prisoners received food, money, clothing, and other supplies from outside sources. Inmates were also periodically permitted to beg for alms outside the Stinche's walls, maintaining their space in public memory. Execution and exile allowed the commune to remove unwanted social deviants from the community, but the Stinche prepared Popolani criminals for communal restoration. I argue that the expulsion reflects this goal. Prisoners could not continue sinning without consequence or sit idly in the stinke forever. Their behavior determined their community's willingness to accept them. Saint Anne, the protector and embodiment of Popolani interests, stands in for the community and takes on the role of civic judge. While scholars have argued that prisoners would identify with the Duke's damnation and social rejection, the Stinke's inmates were not separated from the Florentine community. Instead, the Duke represented one of two options available to a prisoner and warned them against continued social deviance. He symbolized the social rejection that accompanied irredeemable treachery and continued crime. Given short-term prison sentences and the opportunity to return to the communal center, the Stinke's Popolani inmates had not yet crossed this line. The inmates still had the chance to correct their behavior and return to normative society. The kneeling soldiers that Saint Anne accepts represented the prisoner's other possible outcome, which most inmates achieved according to the Stinke's registers. These soldiers embodied the Popolani community that protected Florence during the Duke's reign, and they symbolized the communal center the reformed inmate could return to. Neither accepted nor rejected from the Florentine community, the Stinke's prisoners had the opportunity to return to their former social positions. The Stinke punished criminals through temporary incarceration, but quickly returned reformed inmates to Popolani society. Similarly, the expulsion did not condemn inmates, but instead visualized their options. If they continued to behave treacherously like the Duke, the prisoner would surely find himself damned and likely dead, cast from society's margins and memory. Yet, if they complied with the Stinke's coercion and corrected their behavior, the Popolani prisoner would find themselves returned to community. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay. Our next speaker is Hannah Matthews, presenting Celebrating Evangelism and Earthly Power in a Clarissan Convent, Paolo Veneziano's Santa Chiara Polyptych. Hannah.
The 14th century Santa Chiara Polyptych by Paolo Veneziano is a visually striking work, with vibrant, reflective gilding, highly intricate textile depictions, and a largely original architecturally Gothic frame, and engaging narrative scenes with Byzantine influences common to Venice in this period. The altarpiece itself is massive, measuring more than 2.5 meters wide. But the individual narrative panels depicting scenes from the life of Christ on either side of the coronation of the Virgin, and particularly those of the upper register showing scenes from the lives of St. Francis and St. Clare, are small and require close viewing to fully see their detail and understand their stories. In combination with the altarpiece's original setting, the polyptych's content and distinctive style embody the complex relationship between the Franciscan and Clarissan orders, as well as the intercultural interactions that grew out of Franciscan missions and Venetian mercantile and cultural exchange along Silk Road trade routes during this period. However, while it is a Clarissan altarpiece, its placement in the Clarissan convent church of Santa Chiara in Venice meant that the nuns of this convent would not have seen it. Like members of other female orders in Italy during the 14th century, Clarissans lived under enclosure. Though there were varying levels of enclosure among female convents, the rules of the Clarissan order were particularly strict. Unable to demonstrate their piety through preaching or actions outside the convent like their male Franciscan counterparts, they instead had to rely on maintaining an impeccable reputation. In this context, stringent compliance with the order's rules on enclosure was essential. Clarissan churches thus had a separate choir, with walls or screens that not only kept the nuns from being seen, but often also prevented the nuns from seeing the high altar. The convent and church of Santa Chiara in Venice burned down in 1574, but Jacopo da Barbari includes the church in his 1500 view of Venice. The convent and church were rebuilt and reconsecrated in April 1620 and remained active until the convent was suppressed in 1807. Although there are no surviving records of Santa Chiara's original layout, Clarisant regulations and extant late medieval Clarisant churches can help us imagine some aspects of the destroyed complex. The majority of Clarisant choirs were located inside or upper galleries, or behind the altar to prevent visual contact between the nuns and lay congregation, which did not provide a clear or unobstructed view of the altar. Given that the Santa Chiara polyptych decorated the high altar of Santa Chiara, it is unlikely that the nuns were able to see it. They were therefore not the intended viewers of this altarpiece. This raises the question then of who was the audience. While the Venetian lay congregation would certainly have been a significant part of the audience, the primary close viewers were the Franciscan friars who came to the church to give mass and provide pastoral care to the nuns. Direct access to the high altar would have been restricted to the officiating Franciscans. These panels were thus subject to close inspection by a male Franciscan gaze. Its imagery must be understood in this context and within the ideology and politics of both the Franciscan and Clarisant orders. The Franciscans sought to emulate Christ in their lives, meditating on the Passion and seeing St. Francis as a Christ-like figure. Similarly to Christ, they exchanged their worldly goods for a life of poverty and dressed in the humble Franciscan habit. The symbolic eschewing of poverty is represented in the Santa Chiara polyptych, and St. Francis renounces his worldly goods. In this scene, the naked and emaciated St. Francis is covered only by the corner of the Bishop of Assisi's mantle, having disrobed and rejected his father's wealth to enter a life of holy devotion and poverty as the light of the Holy Spirit descends towards him. The Clarisants, for their part, were meant to emulate the Virgin Mary, with St. Clare serving as an alternate Mary. They emphasized the Virgin as a clothier of Christ and as a model for Franciscan ideals, particularly in relation to the values of poverty, humility, mercy, and chastity embodied by St. Clare. Notably, it is St. Francis himself who places the habit around St. Clare's shoulders in the investiture of St. Clare, clothing her as Mary clothed Christ in a reversal of their roles and mirroring the experience of new Clarisants when they entered the order. In the coronation of the Virgin, Christ crowns his mother as Queen of Heaven, in a scene that echoes the investiture, where Francis gives Clare her habit, signifying her entry into religious life as Christ's crowning of Mary signifies her entry into heaven. The altarpiece was thus an object of reflection for the Franciscan celebrants, for whom this scene would have served as a reminder of their duty. They would meditate on the Passion while being reminded of the Clarisants who inhabited the convent yet remained unseen, who were both a part of their order, but also apart from it. As previously mentioned, the narrative panels of the altarpiece are quite small, particularly those depicting the Pentecost, scenes from the life of St. Clare and St. Francis, and the descent into limbo, which measure only 26 by 19 centimeters. One would need to be close to and facing the altarpiece to read them, as the friars were when performing Mass. While specific references in these panels to the Franciscan order were therefore likely intended for the friars, other aspects of the altarpiece would have been legible to the Venetian laity, particularly those in the larger coronation of the Virgin. In this scene, the Virgin Mary and Christ sit upon a throne draped with a cloth of honor, richly patterned with blue lotus blossoms and a golden vegetal pattern, wearing luxurious blue mantles over red robes covered with a variety of gilded, palmette floral designs that catch the light and attract the eye. These silks represent Tartar cloth, known in Italy as panni tatarici, an expensive imported fabric from Mongol territories. The unification of much of Asia, including modern-day China, Iraq, and Iran, under Mongol rule in the 13th and 14th centuries during the Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace, facilitated an increase in trade between Europe, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Asia. The Mongols forced the resettlement of weavers in these areas, leading to a fusion of Islamic and Chinese textile traditions and designs, as Muslim weavers were relocated to China and Chinese weavers to Central Asia. Though relatively brief, Mongol rule had a lasting impact on European taste. Tatar cloth, often with vegetal patterns, geometric designs, and animals, began arriving in Europe in the second half of the 13th century. Venice and Genoa were the primary importers and distributors of Asian silks transported along Silk Road trade routes. Tiraz, which often served as diplomatic gifts, were also of great importance. This term originally referred to textiles produced in government-sponsored workshops in Islamic societies, but by Paolo Veneziano's time, the meaning had evolved to include any garments or textiles incorporating Arabic inscriptions. These imported silks, replicated in the coronation of the Virgin, were highly desired status symbols in Europe. Sumptuary laws in Venice, as in other cities, restricted access to and use of such silks to only the very wealthy or elite, though their sanctioned use as liturgical vestments and altar cloths displayed them to a broader audience. By displaying the goods so vital to the mercantile state's economy, the Santa Chiara polyptych signaled the expansion of Venice's political, economic, and commercial activity to viewers able to identify the latest styles, trends, and status symbols. Depictions of these textiles also often included pseudoscript designs, which imitate the features of a language, Arabic in this case, but remain unintelligible. In late medieval and early modern Italian paintings and sculptures, pseudoscript most commonly appears on textiles, halos, and representations of written material. Europeans often revered Arabic as the contemporary language spoken in the Holy Land. While depicting Pseudo-Arabic script in painting may have implied a setting in the Holy Land, its presence may also reflect an effort to create a divine rather than earthly space. Language and linguistic comprehension hold a special place in Christian tradition. This is perhaps best exemplified by the ability to speak in tongues granted to the apostles during the Pentecost, which is also included in the Santa Chiara polyptych. The pseudoscript in the altarpiece appears exclusively on painted textiles. In fact, nearly every textile depicted in the coronation of the Virgin features pseudoscript inscriptions imitating Tiraz, including those of the musical angels, though I've only highlighted one here. There is significant debate regarding the accuracy of pseudoscript in Italian painting and its possible sources. Regardless of their authenticity, accuracy, and origin, the inscriptions in the Santa Chiara polyptych would not have been legible to the viewer, nor were they intended to be. Though the audience would not have been able to read the inscriptions in the coronation, they might have assumed that the represented holy figures, as a result of their sacred knowledge, would have understood the text. In this context, pseudoscript may imply a divine language that exists beyond mortal comprehension. The musical angels in the central panel of the altarpiece also evoke a space that is other, divine, and unreachable to the living. Angels play a variety of instruments in the coronation of the Virgin, but this assortment together in one ensemble was unusual for the period, which would not have combined loud instruments with a powerful sound like trumpets, and soft instruments with a delicate sound like harps. Such mixing also occurs in other heavenly scenes and may therefore be intentional. An orchestra discordant to mortal ears could create heavenly music. When combined with luxurious fabrics and illegible script, the celestial choir in the Santa Chiara polyptych elevates such references from a geographic other to an otherworldly one, a space beyond the earthly reach of the laity and Franciscans alike. For the intended viewers, the representation of luxury textiles from the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia in the coronation allude not only to Venetian trading and, in combination with Pseudo-Arabic script, to the Holy Land, but also to the missionary activity of the Franciscan order. Increasing trade with faraway places helped to facilitate a flow of ideas and increasing accessibility of those locations to mendicant missionaries. Since the early 13th century, Franciscans had traveled across North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Asia as part of the preaching and missionary practice that, with their vow of poverty, formed the foundation of their order. Some Franciscan art from the early 1300s contains overt references to the order's missionary practices, particularly images of Franciscan martyrdom or St. Francis' famous encounter with Sultan Amlik al-Kamil in Damatia, Egypt in 1219. However, the Santa Chiara polyptych shows a more subtle approach. The Pseudo-Arabic script on the textiles in the coronation imply their Eastern origins, while reminding the viewer of Franciscan efforts to convert Muslims and other non-Christians, coupled with their awareness of the importance of language to do so. This is also true of the textile on St. Francis's bed in the death of St. Francis, which evokes the Holy Land and further connects the dying saint to Christ by mirroring the pseudoscript and lotus pattern on his garments. Two additional scenes in the Santa Chiara polyptych may have reminded friars of their order's missionary activities. Both the Pentecost and the descent into limbo concern preaching, conversion, and salvation. Bookending the topmost row of narrative panels that depict events from the lives of St. Francis and St. Clare, their placement strengthens the links between St. Francis, Franciscan practice, and Christ. In the Pentecost, the apostles sit in a circle as the Holy Spirit descends in the form of rays of light emanating from the top of the panel. The flames of the Holy Spirit above their heads represent their new ability to speak in tongues, enabling them to preach and spread the messages of the church around the world. This element is central to Franciscan ideology, symbolizing the friars' missionary and evangelical efforts. Just as the apostles were granted the ability to communicate Christianity across cultures, peoples, and religions, the Franciscans aimed to bring people around the world into the church through their missionary work. These efforts to convert non-Christian peoples led to an interest in multilingualism and the study of Arabic. At the far right of the polyptych's upper register, Christ's descent into limbo highlights the salvation that the light of Christ brought the souls of those who had lived lives of faith but predeceased Christ, in effect enhanced by the nearby presence in the altarpiece of the Old Testament prophets Isaiah and David. As they had not been freed of original sin, these souls were unable to enter heaven without Christ's intervention. In Pallaveneziano's rendering, Christ enters in a mandorla of spiritual light, illuminating hell and shining selectively upon the just, but not the damned, who are depicted within the flames. Neither the descent nor the Pentecost are uniquely Franciscan, nor are they by themselves scenes of mission. However, when placed in visual dialogue with other scenes in the Santa Chiara polyptych, particularly positioned on either side of the Franciscan narrative panels, the descent and Pentecost reinforce the messages exhibited throughout the altarpiece. They remind the friars of their duty to spread God's word and bring the light of salvation to those trapped in darkness. Pallaveneziano's Santa Chiara polyptych interacted with the public when the nuns themselves could not, and can most profitably be considered as a message from these Clarissans to the community of lay parishioners and Franciscan celebrants. The altarpiece's individual elements create a cohesive narrative of mission, expansion, and care. Though the Clarissan order was ideologically tied to the Franciscans, their activities were necessarily different. Strict enclosure and gendered limitations prevented Clarissans from preaching or taking part in the missionary work so central to male Franciscan life. While the nuns were unable to participate directly, they supported these efforts through their prayer and pious devotion within their convents. Collectively, the scenes within the polyptych serve as a visual prayer in support of the order's missionary work, a physical manifestation of the nuns' spiritual devotion and contributions to the faith. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Our next speaker is Tim Grogan, presenting Alberti in Stone and Stucco, Traces of the De Re Edificatoria at Giuliano da San Gallo's Palazzo Scala in Florence. Tim.
Dominating the block between Via Giusti and Viale Gramsci is the expansive and luxurious Four Seasons. The hotel, a living museum filled with eye-catching art and architectural detail, is where the privileged guest, spending in the range of $1,000 a night, can meander around the city's largest private garden, sip on designer cocktails at one of the many bars, dine on Michelin-rated food at one of the hotel's restaurants, all before retiring to one of the many intimately decorated bedrooms complete with frescoed ceilings and handcrafted furniture. The hotel credits their origin and much of their success to the ambition of Bartolomeo Scala, who in 1473 made the unusual action of constructing a relatively modest palace in the suburbs of Florence. Although the construction of large-scale family palaces characterized this period in Florence for those who could afford to do so, the circumstances surrounding the creation of the Palazzo Scala were unconventional. These conditions enabled a kind of architectural experimentation that resulted in a palace that was more deeply and visibly engaged with Roman antiquity. From what architectural historians have been able to recreate of the original structure, it is clear that Bartolomeo Scala and its architect, Giuliano da Sangallo, drew upon a significant understanding of Leon Battista Alberti's pivotal architectural treatise on the art of building, published in 1485, likely after the completion of the palace. By systematically identifying the commonalities between this treatise and the most recent reconstruction of the palace's original character, particularly its unprecedented features, the influence of Alberti's theories become identifiable and illustrate that previous scholars have underestimated the extent of formal characteristics that the two share. During Bartolomeo Scala's lifetime, the zone of Florence nestled against the city's northern walls belonged primarily to numerous convents and monasteries that utilized this land predominantly for agriculture. This gave this area the appearance of the countryside, as is visible in Bonsignore's 1584 map of the city. As with the landscape that once surrounded it, the physical character of the Palazzo Scala has undergone a series of transformations over the centuries to serve the needs of its subsequent residents that have massively altered its appearance. What remains intact from the old palace is limited to a handful of rooms that surround the courtyard on the ground floor and some of the decorations that ornament these earliest spaces. The architectural historian Francesca Bordoni's 2009 analysis of the property allows for a more comprehensive understanding of the original building's organizational layout, so that the majority of the ground floor spaces can be hypothetically reconstructed. During the 15th century, the palace's entrance was on the southern facade, oriented perpendicular to the street, and would be indirectly entered through a side door on Borgo Pinti that led to the southernmost portion of the garden. From the garden, the visitor then entered the two-story villa through a single-story portico. This southern wing, the largest of the four, consisted of a prominent loggia, the entrance vestibule, and a kitchen towards the right. Beyond the entrance vestibule, the visitor would enter the courtyard of the villa. The ground floor of this courtyard consists of 3 archways on each side that are flanked by Tuscan pilasters, lending it the appearance and dignity of triumphal arches. Above each arch is a large rectangular frieze of sculpted stucco panels attributed to Bertoldo di Giovanni. A richly decorated ambulatory surrounds the court and is distinguished by a juxtaposition between long barrel vaulted halls and shallow sail vaults in the 4 corners. Near the center of the western wing of the cortile is a 2-room chapel that consists of a short barrel vaulted antechamber and a domed altar space. Nearly opposite the chapel and across the courtyard was a library that was flanked by 2 vaulted studies that comprised most of the eastern wing. Befitting his name, which translates in English to a ladder, a motif commonly found in his palace, Scala had steadily ascended Florence's social and political hierarchy, despite his status as a non-Florentine who had been born the son of a miller. Equipped with an education from the University of Florence in law, oratory, and poetry, Scala would capitalize on this exposure to appeal to the sensibilities that permeated the Medici-dominated public sphere of Florence through the construction of a modestly sized yet scrupulously designed palace. Most palaces within Florence adhered to a societally ingrained set of rules that regulated the conspicuous display of individual wealth in keeping with their republican values. Although revolutionary in their own right, there exists a typological conformity stemming from medieval presidents and Florentine republicanism in each of the above palaces, including the most influential in Florence, the Palazzo Medici and the Palazzo Rucellai, as well as other projects carried out by Giuliano da Sangallo under different circumstances during relatively the same period, the Palazzo Gondi and the Palazzo Cocchi. By contrast, the Palace of Scala operates more as a villa, despite its placement within the city's walls. Its bucolic location, coupled with the chancellor's inherent responsibility to entertain foreign dignitaries and a plethora of other guests, necessitated its hybridized use and required innovation in its design. To construct this building, Scala enlisted the young Giuliano da Sangallo. Giuliano's use of antique precedents as inspiration for his contemporary architecture is well recorded, and his career was characterized by his outstanding ability to incorporate architectural features from the sketches he produced. Yet, at this time, there were no known archaeological remains for domestic residents residences that corresponded to the descriptions of ancient authors. To replicate a Roman domus, it was therefore necessary to refer to these such literary sources. Chief among them was Vitruvius's De Architectura, which was the only treatise to survive from antiquity written by an architect. However, this treatise was notoriously difficult to translate and would not be understood in entirety until the early 16th century. I believe that Leon Battista Alberti's engagement with Vitruvius's De Architectura, contained within his own treatise on the art of building, served as Scala and Giuliano's manual for understanding and interpreting Vitruvian principles. Alberti, the famed Florentine humanist who spent most of his career and life outside the city, was a prominent character within the Medicean sphere of influence and is credited with designing two major all'antica-styled projects within Florence during the second half of the 15th century, carrying out work for the facade of Santa Maria Novella and the Palazzo Rucellai. His treatise, in its 10 books, was modeled directly after Vitruvius's, except Vitruvius sought to tell readers how buildings were built, while Alberti sought to prescribe how contemporary buildings are to be built. The hybrid nature of the palace accords to a great extent with ideas of Alberti, who wrote, "There is one type of private building that combines the dignity of a city house with the delight of a villa. This is the suburban hortus." The lifestyle Alberti ascribed to this type of home for a private citizen, one that combines the benefits of leisure and learning and seclusion, while affording the patron ready access to the urban environment for the carrying out of civic business, would have directly appealed to Scala's desires and sensibilities and seems to reflect how the palace was used. Poliziano, the poet humanist who despised Scala, pointedly described the palace and its perceived uses in a scathing poem. Within the safe Pomeranium by the walls, the madman, rich from public embezzlement, constructs an urban villa where he takes his ease among obscene wolves, not to call them something worse, where an old man, rancid with gout, Greeks it up amidst overflowing cups. Poliziano's poem implies that Scala cavorts with prostitutes and eats and drinks to excess, all while enjoying the writings and lessons of the Greeks from within his villa. This is assuredly an exaggerated account meant to damage the reputation of a rival. However, it illustrates the Palazzo Scala's utility for country-style enjoyment in addition to its more practical uses as an urban palace. Scholars of the Palazzo Scala have consistently correlated certain attributes of its design with Albertine principles. The entirety of the palace was organized around the cortile. This cortile has long been acknowledged as Albertine due to its unusual characteristics. Although many early Florentine palaces featured courtyards beyond their entrance vestibules, Scala broke from the typological standard in three major ways. First, it occupied more of the building's footprint proportionally. Second, it possessed 2 rather than 3 stories. And third, it has a post and lintel system that reflects Roman rather than Florentine precedents, such as what can be seen at the Colosseum. In other words, the columns of the courtyard directly engage with the horizontal component, the architrave, while Florentine courtyard arcades, as seen with the Ospedale degli Innocenti and the Palazzo Medici, typically had the columns engage directly with the arches. Scholars have similarly connected the placement of the chapel in relation to this cortile to Alberti's recommendations. Scala's ownership of the domestic chapel is itself unusual and was only possible due to the direct intervention of his Medici backers. Equally unusual is its placement on the ground floor, as previous palace chapels were always situated on the piano nobile in relation to the main reception and entertainment spaces of the typical Florentine palace. Coinciding with this unusual action, Alberti writes that there should follow the vestibule, very visible even at first glance, a chapel dedicated to the divine cult with an altar. Also noted by previous scholars, walking about the ground floor of the Palazzo Scala, one is struck by the variation of forms throughout, attributable to a diversity of shape and vaulting. The palace features sail vaults, a ribbed vault in a room of unknown use, 3 different lengths of barrel vaults, and a dome space in the chapel. Alberti states that the guest should remain doubtful whether he should stay where he is or go beyond towards other parts that attract him with their pleasant elegance, so that from a square or rectangular space, you pass into a circular one, and from this again into a polygonal one, and from the last into another, neither with all curved nor all straight walls. Looking at the floor plan of the palace, there are several different kinds of rooms, square, rectangular, and circular, that are connected by rows of doors that lead from one to the next without the necessity to re-enter the cortile. This combination of rooms, especially so linked by an interior series of doors, was not typical to Florentine architecture, and the extensive experimentation illustrated with the diversity of vaulting and form exemplifies the radical mindsets of Scala and Giuliano. In addition to these acknowledged correspondences, it is possible to identify additional harmonies between Scala's palace and Alberti's treatise by applying Bordoni's recent reconstruction. A feature of particular significance that has not previously been acknowledged for its alignment with Alberti's ideas was the decision to situate the building's primary entrance to the south. This unusual choice ignores the widespread Florentine tradition of situating a palace's primary entrance so that it faced the street. Instead, Palazzo Scala's original entrance echoes many of Alberti's recommendations for villas, which he says should have a generous reception area for the arrival of guests. It should be in the view of some city, town, and delightful gardens. In addition to capturing the gaze of the visitor as they arrive from the city, this orientation was preferred by the ancients, according to Alberti, because in summer, the arc of the sun would be too high for its rays to enter, whereas in the winter, it would be low enough, ensuring the consistent use of the portico and southern loggia throughout the year. Each of the rooms surrounding the cortile, besides perhaps the studies, are situated in a way that follows Alberti's recommendations. The chapel's entrance faces east towards the rising sun in the direction where the earth was first lit up. The guest room is placed in the vicinity of the vestibule with access to the southern loggia. The library and the books it held were located on the eastern wing to avoid the growth of mold and mildew. And the kitchen is located near the guest quarters, but not too close along the southern facade. The organizational scheme's conformity to Alberti's recommendations presents his treatise or awareness of it as the likely source. The majority of the decorations within the palace can be attributed to the empirical knowledge Giuliano gathered in Rome and Florence that are recorded in his two surviving sketchbooks. However, the use of frieze panels reflects Albertine methodologies. The above friezes, acting as an attic story to the arches and entablature below, would have emphasized the architectural unity of the space that the repetitions of the arches created. The solidity presented by the arches would have been particularly pronounced if considering that the space would have been without the 17th and 18th century grotesques that currently occupy much of the intervening space on the courtyard walls. Of the 12 imposing panels appearing as a continuous ribbon, 11 reflect scenes from Scala's own writing, the 100 Epilogues, a compendium of moralizing tales. 2 of these 11, Victory and Military Glory, depict triumphal processions. According to scholars of Bertoldo di Giovanni, the depictions on the southern wall, in particular, seen at the bottom of the slide, were meant to evoke Scala's personal triumph over adversity. It is easy to imagine the knowledgeable and vaunting Scala expounding on the meanings of each panel to his guests or encouraging them to derive their meanings from the scenes illustrated. Alberti's recommendations for narrative panels as a form of appropriate ornamentation for villa's interior is remarkably akin to the program carried out by Scala. I would separate stone frames in appropriate and noble situations along the wall in which to place pictures and also panels like those borne by Pompey in his triumph, depicting his glorious achievements by land and sea. Or better still, I would prefer illustrations of the tales that poets make for moral instructions. The personal involvement of Scala's own writing into his design was atypical and points to his intentions within the space. The selection of such a design program is not only permitted by Alberti as not violating decorum, but directly follows his instructions as it is complete with proper spacing, triumph, and moral instruction. Seen individually, the similarities described today could appear to be casual. However, the overwhelming relation between the suburban villa of Scala and the recommendations of Alberti suggest a more systematic connection between the two. The presents shed light on Bartolomeo Scala's intentions, the architectural prowess of Giuliano da Sangallo, and the availability and circulation of humanistic information in the cultural epicenters of Florence and Rome. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Don't sit down. I'd like to invite our first three speakers up to the front of the room. We've heard three extraordinary papers with a virtual visit to Venice and Florence, and you now have a chance to ask the experts a question or further information about their research. So if you would raise your hand, and Jonathan Nelson will bring the microphone to your seat, and if you could introduce yourself and then ask your question. This is your chance.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Galdi. To the first speaker, Lindsay, could you just give us a little bit brief background of the Duke of Athens and how he was called, or did he come to Florence, and did he leave without putting up a struggle?
Yes, absolutely. So the Duke of Athens had previously been in Florence under as the temporary viceroy, as I had said, to the Kingdom of Naples. Florence had been going through a lot of financial and political turmoil and had called in the Kingdom of Naples for help, essentially. And so he was briefly there for about a year and was very well received by the Florentine public. So when they again faced some financial troubles in around 1342, they call him back in, wanting him to return to the city and help as he had before. However, this time, he very quickly made a lot of enemies. He declared himself the ruler for life, it extended enfranchisement to lower guilds, and really created enemies, as I had said. And so through this, by angering a lot of people, he was then, the Popolani, the middle class, really attempted to throw him out of Florence, and he certainly put up a fight. So the feast day of St. Anne in July was the first day that riots began, but he holed himself up in Palazzo Vecchio for a little more than a month before he was finally removed from Florence. So he was certainly not well liked and not quickly removed from Florence.
Because
Thank
in
you.
the fresco, there seems to be arms on the floor beneath it. So there seems to be arms left behind. So there was a fight, and there was something known that there was any kind of active warfare or something approaching that.
There wasn't any organized warfare because he had disbanded all of the citizen groups and all the armed soldiers that were in Florence at that time. The objects below him are generally seen as the foregone instruments of justice. So a broken sword indicating broken justice, broken scales of justice. And then what a lot of scholars see is an unopened book of laws. But there was a lot of street rioting is essentially what was occurring. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Elaine Ruffalo. Lindsay, it's for you again. Can you make a comment on the image of the Palazzo Vecchio? It looked so different than how we see it today.
Yeah, absolutely. So the image of Palazzo Vecchio is one of the reasons we're able to date the painting up until 1349 because there were, I'm not remembering the exact words for the structures that were built around the doors of Palazzo Vecchio. But during the Duke of Athens' reign, he had essentially built up some fortifications around Palazzo Vecchio, which are now no longer there and were removed in 1349. So that's why it looks so different, because it has been changed since and was changed pretty quickly after he was removed from Florence.
Hi, my name is Jane Zaloga. And first off, thank all three of you for really wonderful papers. They're all very interesting and very well put together and kind of fascinating. I actually have a question for all of you individually. So Lindsay, I'll do you last because you've gotten questions so far. With regard to, let's start with the Alberti talk. Okay, with that, I'm just kind of curious as to the fact that all these spaces are on the ground floor of the villa. And I was just wondering if you had any comments about, or if Alberti had any comments about putting these kinds of rooms, which, for instance, the chapel, which typically would be on an upper floor, down on the ground floor. And also then, if you thought anything about how this suburban villa might relate to, say, the villa at Poggio a Caiano, which is also associated with Giuliano da Sangallo. That was kind of more of a countryside villa. So were there kind of differences in that?
Yeah, so in the discussion in Leon Battista Alberti's treatise talking about a residential home, it's typically talking about a palace. And that differs from a villa in certain circumstances, but a lot of it has carryover. And talking about the chapel in particular, he recommends that villas be single story if possible, because generally villas during antiquity were thought to be and largely proven to be generally one story if the room could allow. But that's obviously if only the space could allow. Scala's palace is unique that it's 2 stories, and a lot of that is considered because he couldn't afford 3 stories, but it also in a way conforms more to Alberti's recommendations, where it's really clear what's private space and what's public space. And he wanted his chapel to be emphasized. That would be the most prestigious element of his palace, because it was incredibly unusual, even 100 years earlier than that, for someone incredibly wealthy and incredibly powerful to have a private palace chapel. It was really only for royalty. So the fact that a chancellor, someone who was born the son of a miller, had his own palace chapel was something he would have undoubtedly wanted to highlight. And it being on the first floor allowed him to do that. Talking about Poggio a Caiano, which is started in 1485 by Giuliano da Sangallo, generally believed. There's so much overlap between this project and that project. And yes, they are different in the circumstances of that. That's a true villa. This is more suburban, but there is so much about Alberti's treatise that is also has overlap there. It shows really a more maturing understanding of the treatise. I mean, the idea of it being raised on a vaulted cryptoporticus, and then it's also oriented to the south. It's on a prominent hill that overlooks a river with rear gardens. The courtyard is completely different because it's covered and it has the famous barrel vault over it, but the different loggias on all 4 sides allowed for that same kind of experience of being able to truly enjoy leisure in a villa. So it's my belief that Poggio a Caiano has even more Albertian principles, but much different because there's more money to do so.
Thanks, Tim. And then for Hannah, this is, and you may not know this, and I don't know this, and I'm just kind of curious in general, is do you have you come across any information about how these images were illuminated at any point, specifically, because those images up so high, I'm just curious as to how visible they would have been to anybody at any point in time, especially since you're talking about how small they are.
Right. And I think that's a really excellent point about this altarpiece and kind of how I've been looking at it. I don't have a lot of information on exactly how it would have been illuminated. Obviously, there would have been candles, and it definitely would not have been as it would be seen today if you go to a museum environment with direct light. That said, I think the gilding would stand out possibly even more in the candlelight, and the flickering candlelight on that gilding would have been really striking. At the same time, that enhances this aspect of visibility, right? So those small scenes, which already would have been hard for the Venetian laity to see, would be even more difficult to see with dimmer lighting. And so the Franciscan celebrants giving the mass, who were facing the altarpiece, because at that point in time, mass was given facing the altarpiece, not the congregation, would have really been the only ones to be able to see them in that level of detail, which I think also indicates the importance of those scenes for Franciscan ideology versus what may have been more understandable for the laity and those underlying messages.
And when you saw the altarpiece, And was it standing up when you saw it? Were you able to see the small scenes above, or was it on his back?
So for context, the altarpiece is undergoing restoration. It's almost done. It's beautiful. And I had the opportunity to go see it in person this summer in the conservation lab. And when I went and saw it, it was still taken apart. So I got to go very up close to all the individual panels, and it was a really incredible experience. Yes, in Venice.
I have questions. Can you hear me? I have questions for Tim and for Lindsay. I'll start with Tim. Yeah. Did you say that Alberti's treatise was not publicly known yet when this Palace Villa was written or built?
So this is kind of the grand question that got me into this topic, is that most scholars believe that it was largely completed by 1452 when Alberti presented it to Nicholas V before some of his major building projects, but it wasn't formally published until 1485, which is after when I believe the construction of Palazzo Scala was finished. There are other people such as Francesco Bordoni that believed it started in 1473, but wasn't finished until the 1490s. But a huge part of this is that there was circulation of ideas between Rome and Florence. There was this really tight-knit group of architects interested in antiquity that were constantly discussing it, visiting monuments and sketching them and sharing their ideas, and also trying to translate Vitruvius. So his ideas were known, and it is known that Filarete, another Florentine architect, had some level of comprehension of Alberti's treatise in the early 1470s as well. So I believe them all operating within the same kind of courts, but there's no proof that any of these men knew each other, but I believe they had to, or at least been aware of these concepts.
Where is the codex that you mentioned? You saw the drawings?
The codex, the Codex Barberini is in the Vatican. And it's just a compilation of all his sketches throughout his career, starting from when he first visited Rome in the 1460s until he died in 1516. And it was collected and ultimately published by his nephew.
And then for Lindsay, I was curious, since Florence is, or was at that point, a Republican government, and all of the, can you hear me now? Okay. Since Florence was a Republican government at that point, and all of these different institutions and government bodies were run by the people, I was wondering if you knew, or if we can surmise who or what kind of person was deciding to put that fresco in the Stinche.
So as far as who is commissioning or deciding to put this fresco in the Stinche, we really don't have much of an idea who that was. However, given the fact that it is in a civic building that is run by prominent members of the community, it's pretty certain that at least a government body, if not the administration of the Stinche, was responsible for making that decision. But yeah, there's not any definitive proof as far as who's funding it and why they're doing that. Thank you.
Okay, if there are any further questions, you can ask our speakers during the coffee break. We'll take 25 minutes for a coffee break now. And there's 2 stations, one right outside this door and one outside the back. So you can sort of divide and conquer. You will find coffee and cookies and little chocolates and tasty things. We will resume at 10 minutes past 11. And if we could just thank our speakers for a really great job. Welcome back. We will now hear the final 4 presentations with an opportunity after the last paper to ask questions of all 4 speakers. In these presentations, we move into the 16th 17th, and even early 20th century, traveling virtually to Bologna, Cremona, Florence, and across the Italian peninsula during the Fascist period. Our next speaker is Noah Stevenstein, presenting Portraiture Between Power and Prophecy, Parmigianino's allegory of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Noah.
For many art historians, especially of the Italian Renaissance, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V is best known for his influential patronage of the Venetian painter Titian. The Museo del Prado, for instance, displays a trio of immediately recognizable royal portraits. Hung together and in chronological order, the display makes an argument that it was Titian who served as the painter for Charles V and his family. But the continued focus on this art historical relationship has left other portraits of the emperor underserved, especially a fascinating image painted by Parmigianino at Charles's 1530 coronation. In the very large, almost 2-meter painting, a young boy presents a terrestrial globe to the Holy Roman Emperor. Above, a female allegory holds a palm and laurel sprig, backgrounded by a sweeping green expanse. The imperial image contrasts with the mimetic quality of Parmigianino's other portraits for allegorical effect. Scholarly treatment of this painting has primarily concerned its attribution. Some scholars give the painting to Parmigianino in full, but more often, the work is attributed to Parmigianino's studio, or considered an early copy after the artist. This present most studied version in a private collection at least accurately summarizes Parmigianino's original image, as it matches a description by Giorgio Vasari and a copy by Rubens, the latter with artistic liberties. However, Parmigianino's image is important because it represents one of the first allegorical portraits of a ruler, in which traditional insignia are replaced by abstract symbols of power. And during my talk today, I want to argue that Parmigianino intended to allegorize Charles as the prophesied last world emperor, a messianic leader first described in the 4th century and invoked in pamphlets circulating in Bologna at the time of his coronation. Parmigianino's portrait manifests a future in which the ruler leads a global Catholic empire, one that would bring about a golden age exceeding that of even the Roman Emperor Augustus. In advance of his ceremonial coronation, Charles V sailed to Genoa in August of 1529, only processing into Bologna with his entourage on November 5th of that year. His prolonged visit allowed the emperor to smooth tensions following the violence of the emperor's 1527 sack of Rome. Simultaneously, Italian nobles sought to win favor with Charles by employing artists to impress the emperor during his sojourn. Although the precise dating of Parmigianino's allegory is unknown, scholars agree that it was painted during the Bologna portion of the visit, which culminated in the emperor's coronation by Clement VII as Holy Roman Emperor in Bologna San Petronio. The second edition of Giorgio Vasari's Vitae provides the fullest account of Parmigianino's creation. I'm not going to read the whole passage, but I want to emphasize the most important points: that Parmigianino's portrait of Charles was painted without a formal sitting and was based on the artist observing the emperor going to eat. It was a very large portrait, which showed fame crowning the emperor and Hercules offering him the world. Parmigianino showed it to Pope Clement VII, who sent the portrait to the artist to present it to Charles V, who apparently wanted to keep it, but Parmigianino refused, saying that it was unfinished, and the portrait ended up in the guardaroba of the Duke of Mantua. Vasari's remark that the portrait was made without a formal sitting in a double-sided study sheet at the Morgan Library in New York indeed suggests that Parmigianino's image of Charles stemmed from his observation of the emperor from life, without the creation of a detailed portrait study. Vasari's identification of the boy as Hercules is generally accepted by scholarship, considering his lion's pelts. However, the female allegory more likely represents victory than fame, as she holds the laurel and palm leaves more often associated with that persona and not the trumpet of fame. Moreover, the episode of the presentation of the portrait to the emperor seems doubtful and may represent an invented experimentum crucis in Vasari's narrative, Because Parmigianino fails to give up the portrait, Vasari's reader understands why the artist's career flounders thereafter. However, the portrait certainly ended up in Mantua, where Vasari saw it and where Rubens eventually copied it in the early 17th century. Interestingly, however, Rubens was essentially the only artist to engage with Parmigianino's design, indicating the portrait's strong ideological link to the 1530 coronation. Organizers of the coronation, as it was the first to occur outside of Rome, made special efforts to ensure the perceived legitimacy of the event. In his ceremonial procession to the city center, Charles's path mirrored ancient imperial entries and was decorated with ephemeral triumphal arches and not medieval tableaux vivants. In addition, organizers restructured San Petronio, the basilica in which the coronation was held, to resemble Old St. Peter's in Rome, going so far as to install a disc of porphyry inside the entrance that mirrored one marking where Charlemagne was crowned in 800. Such arrangements were made to appease Charles's advisors, especially his Piedmontese Grand Chancellor, Mercarino Arborio, Marquis of Gattinara, who worried Lutherans might challenge Charles's authority as illegitimate. Gattinara envisioned the employment of medieval prophecy to validate Charles's rule, specifically the revitalization of prophecy. In particular, Charles was linked to a 4th century text from the Sibylline oracles, then attributed to the Tiburtine Sibyl. This prophecy predicted a last world emperor who would bring about the kingdom of God by defeating the heretic and render a global empire to Christ, bringing about a golden age. Over the following millennia, the prophecy was altered in significant ways. In the 7th century, the heretic was identified as Islam. In the 11th century, a coda described the last world emperor as the second Charlemagne, from the nation of the lily and possessing a lofty forehead, high eyebrows, wide eyes, and an aquiline nose. It was also believed that the last world emperor would chastise the church and bear the name Charles. At the end of the Quattrocento, Charles VIII of France, following his invasion of Italy, seemed a suitable candidate. But after his early death, Charles V emerged, possessing that important name, blended blood of the competing French and German houses, and significant land holdings in the New World, the discovery and potential Christianization of which had clearly defined prophetic implications. The identification of Charles as the last world emperor was first made in 1511. Thus, prophetic pamphlets circulated in Germany prior to the imperial election in 1519. After Charles's chastisement of the church during the sack of Rome, onlookers eagerly awaited his coronation, and pamphlets combining the relevant prophetic texts again circulated in 1530. These documents were largely text-based paraphernalia. The title page of this example, however, importantly bears Charles's personal impresa, which consisted of the image of the columns of Hercules and indicated his motto, plus ultra, or further or beyond. The combination implied that Charles was to go beyond the columns, which had been legendarily placed by the ancient hero Hercules at the Strait of Gibraltar. The symbol was designed by Luigi Marliano to commemorate Charles's leadership of the Order of the Golden Fleece beginning in 1517, and also appears in Parmigianino's portrait. But the portrait includes some idiosyncrasies that seem to indicate the artist's knowledge of the prophetic context of Charles's coronation. Not only referencing the plus ultra impresa, Parmigianino's inclusion of the young Hercules testifies to the ancient origin of Charles's heritage, which the emperor traced back to the Roman emperors and Aeneas, as well as Noah and the patriarchs, culminating in Adam, an exceptional genealogy that was emphasized in many prophetic pamphlets. In the painting, Parmigianino has also flattered Charles's physiognomy. Charles was known to have a pronounced underbite resulting from inbreeding within the Habsburg family. Beyond mere aesthetics, however, Parmigianino's Charles matches written descriptions of the last world emperor with his wide eyes, high eyebrows, and importantly, aquiline nose. This was in part due to the emperor's self-fashioning, as Charles restyled his page boy haircut during his sojourn in Italy into a shorter coiffure in a Roman style to mimic that of some ancient emperors. Most importantly, however, the image promises peace. Can we imagine Charles's gesture with his hand on his sword hilt to indicate that he has just sheathed his weapon? The identification of the female allegory as victory supports this reading, as she was typically employed in iconography that commemorated a battle won in the beginning of peace. The central prophetic promise of a golden age of peace would have added poignancy for an artist who had fled Rome during the sack of 1527 and for residents of the Italian peninsula more broadly. Other works from Parmigianino's Bologna period indicate his awareness of the prophetic context. He designed a chiaroscuro woodcut depicting Augustus and the Tiburtine Sibyl. This image shows a scene from the Golden Legend, in which the Sibyl shows the ancient emperor a vision of the Virgin and Child after he asks her whether he should allow the Roman Senate to deify him. Although Marzia Feati has suggested that the print may present a pro-papal view of the limits of imperial power, it also illustrates a significant prophetic event from the last Golden Age, a period which Charles aimed to emulate and surpass. From his sojourn in Rome, Parmigianino certainly knew that the ancient emperor was famously clean-shaven. That Augustus wears a beard in the print could in fact indicate that the artist was referring to Charles. And Parmigianino's prophetic imagery was influential on other artists, or perhaps more removed by the Bologna coronation. The print's iconography resonates with the slightly later painting by Peter van Kempenaar, who designed a triumphal arch for the Bologna coronation, although this work is believed to have been painted slightly later and in the north. Van Kempenaar provides further indication of the impact of this prophetic context on artists active during the Bologna coronation. Peace could be achieved through a global Catholic empire, which Charles's Plus Ultra Impresa and the Order of the Golden Fleece sought. Certainly, the motto referenced the planned evangelism of the Order of the Golden Fleece into the Holy Land and Africa, called for in the prophecy. But Marliano's contacts with Peter Mater d'Anghiera, an Italian historian who chronicled early discoveries in the New World, suggest that it may have also referenced the Americas. This global empire expanded beyond the land shown on the beholder's side of the globe. Although if Charles were to look down, he might see the Americas, then often thought to be an appendage of Asia. So we might ask, what world does Hercules hand the emperor? Well, during the coronation's official ceremony, Pope Clement VII gave Charles a golden orb, which the official chronicler of the coronation described as a golden apple, perhaps motivating Clement VII's official papal bull commemorating the ceremony to correct. We place the globe representing the image of the whole world into his hands. Conceivably, the pageantry of the ceremony would have included representations of inhabitants of the far side of the globe. Ferdinand II of Aragon's funeral procession, for instance, which also marked the ascension of Charles V, concluded with a car surmounted by a golden globe inscribed Ulterius Nisi Morte and filled with figures dressed as Indians. Charles's and his advisors' abstract ideas to control America had morphed into a clearer picture of global empire by 1530. Significant sums of American gold, an estimated 17,000 kilograms, helped fund his invasion of the Italian peninsula. Conversely, the fleet assembled for this invasion in 1527 was used to intimidate Hernan Cortez's potentially rebellious European supporters by spreading rumors that the ships were sailing to New Spain. Therefore, by 1530, Charles's vast resources in the West had propelled the ceremony to success, to a coronation that would have validated his unique and divine right to these lands. A print from a series by Martin van Heemskerk celebrating Charles's victories provides a retrospective view of this history. An image of paternal triumph dedicated to King Philip II, who received Charles's territories, but not his imperial title. The sixth scene shows Amerindians roasting the flesh of a Spanish soldier as other natives bring his impaled colleague towards the spit. A battle scene in the background is anything but won by the Spanish. The print's inscription, which reads in English, "The Indians, who once nourished themselves with human flesh, have now become civilized, overcome by the invincible weapons of the emperor." The scene is dated to 1530, the same year as Parmigianino's portrait. with knowledge of Charles's coronation, where Clement VII placed the world into the emperor's hands, a 16th century viewer might have interpreted Charles's invincible weapons to be spiritual. How else could the Spanish army overcome the scene designed by Heemskerk? Although Charles's attempts to achieve a global empire were ultimately unsuccessful, his impact on the modern era was enormous in terms of the degree to which imperial ideas spread throughout Europe and eventually the world. Perhaps it is in this same vein that we can find a new appreciation for Parmigianino's allegory. The portrait introduced an important genre in which allegory could be employed to visually concretize power. Parmigianino's trailblazing composition combined distinctly ancient and contemporary imagery to communicate a prophetic message, allowing multivalent interpretations for rulers and scholars and the Renaissance and today. Most importantly, however, Parmigianino's allegory embodies the miracle and the deceit of portraiture and of prophecy, their ability to project a powerful vision of an individual into the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Noah. Our next speaker is Catherine Rabogliati, presenting Immortalizing Encryption in Sofonisba Anguissolo's Boston Self-Portrait, circa 1556. Katie.
In her miniature self-portrait in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Cremonese painter Sofonisba Anguissola shows herself holding a large tondo with a central monogram and a Latin inscription around the perimeter. As the most dynamic of her roughly 15 early self-portraits, the Boston miniature is an obvious exercise in self-identification and a declaration of worth. Although it is routinely and rightfully cited in discussions of Sofonisba's personality, ambitions, and style, scholars often become entangled in attempts to conclusively decipher the inscription and monogram. I argue instead that no single interpretation exists. Each of the miniature's main elements, the self-portrait, the monogram, and the inscription, contain layers of meaning that communicate different yet complementary information about Sofonisba. The viewer was expected to decode these elements, engaging in the playful exercise that was decryption. Sofonisba designed her self-portrait as an artistic and intellectual calling card, offering it as her contribution to a courtly environment that appreciated witty double meaning and genteel accomplishment in the hopes of gaining a permanent court appointment. Like most of Sofonisba's self-portraits, the Boston miniature was likely intended for a courtly viewer and is best understood in the rich ludic environment of 16th century Italian courts, which reveled in intellectual games involving the composition and decryption of allegorical devices that positively commemorated the players. I propose that the miniature be interpreted like an impresa, a personal device that combines an image and text to express an aspect of the bearer's personality or thoughts. However, in contrast to the relative simplicity of imprese, the complexity of the self-portrait's image and text speak to a multiplicity of meanings. Much like scholars today, the early modern viewer interpreted the painting based on the aspects that most struck them. Its purpose was not to favorably commemorate one aspect of Sofonisba's character, but rather to immortalize all those traits that made her the ideal courtier. In the Boston self-portrait, Sofonisba combined her established self-portrait iconography with motifs familiar to her courtly viewers to create a composition that is both visually unique and ideally positioned to appeal to her intended audience. Her choice of a miniature format is itself unremarkable, as portrait miniatures were common in court settings and valued for their intimacy. Their diminutive size meant that miniatures were often worn, displayed in specialized cabinets, or passed from hand to hand. The exclusivity of the viewing experience increased their efficacy as representations of absent persons, demonstrating the profound connection between the sitter and the bearer or viewer. Sofonisba captures her audience's attention with her direct gaze and playful smile, and ensures continued viewing by presenting them with a multi-layered composition that puts a twist on the classic miniature format. The most significant deviation is her inclusion of the tondo held in her prominently displayed hands. While the disc itself recalls portrait medals, which often included inscriptions and vegetal motifs, no other surviving painted portrait miniature depicts a sitter presenting a round object to the viewer. Portraits that show their sitters holding small medals, cameos, or other objects that demonstrate their status and intellect offer the most fruitful parallel. Like those sitters, in this case Hortensia de Bardi, Sofonisba presents her inscribed tondo to the viewer, inviting them to consider its importance. However, Sofonisba offers her audience an image laden with intensely personal significance, as opposed to more general familial or geographic references. The relative complexity of the tondo's design and messaging allows Sofonisba to engage more deeply with contemporary trends and to demonstrate her understanding of the multivalent significance of words, abbreviations, and appearances. The most resonant element on the tondo is the central monogram. Despite the scarcity of information about early modern monograms, they were often relatively simple 1- or 2-letter compositions that encoded either the creator or recipient's name. Courtiers also used monograms as a means of identification, often with the added dimension of playful obfuscation. Contemporary pattern and handwriting books included examples and instructions for composing monograms, which women were particularly encouraged to incorporate into their needlework, as evinced by these visual instructions for composing a monogram of the name Lavinia from a popular handwriting book. In the context of 16th century court life, embroidery served as a suitably humble means for women to showcase both their education and technical ability. As an acceptable medium for women's artistic expression, embroidery was thus an ideal source of inspiration for Sofonisba. The painter inserted herself into an environment that understood embroidery as a vehicle for self-fashioning, relying on courtiers' recognition of her allusions to the archetypically feminine craft to reify her own artistic experimentations. In presenting a painted rather than embroidered monogram, Sofonisba not only meets the expectations for female courtiers, but surpasses them. Despite its intricacy, audiences would have understood the Boston monogram as an identifier, the undeciphered letters themselves signifying that Sofonisba was familiar with and capable of participating in the culture of playful encryption fostered in Italian courts. Indeed, she almost certainly created the Boston self-portrait for a setting that embraced games involving spontaneous displays of wit, intellect, and virtue. The 16th century saw an exponential rise in the popularity of parlor games because they encouraged competitive creativity and facilitated skillful and clever experimentation. Although most parlor games called for displays of ingenuity, those involving emblem composition were particularly effective vehicles of self-fashioning, as players attempted to conjure verbal descriptions or compose mottos that contributed to the creation of public personae. In the game of Imprese, for example, players would alternately compose fictive imprese for their fellow players or identify famous individuals imprese based off their companions' descriptions. The viewer and composer needed to combine their knowledge of literary sources and allegorical images with a personal understanding of the bearer. Isolta Brembati, for instance, conceived of her impresa with layered references to her intellectual, moral, and social accomplishments. Accordingly, her contemporaries variously interpreted it as signifying chastity, honor, and/or literary skills. In a courtly ludic setting, men and women alike composed imprese that had multiple equally valid interpretations. Such allegorical and elusive complexity in turn increased players' enjoyment as they competed to see who could most skillfully decipher a given device, a conceit upon which Sofonisba also draws in her self-portrait. Just as imprese combined text and image to create meaning, Sofonisba used the Latin inscription and the self-portrait's overall composition to convey a multivalent message. The artist signs her painting as by her own hand, proudly proclaiming it her creation. Sofonisba depicts those same hands on either side of that phrase, physically emphasizing its and their importance. Her fingers rest on the tondo's rim, touching and partially obscuring the words virgo and speculo, a gesture that draws attention to her virginity and use of a mirror. Sofonisba's self-identification as Virgo likely refers not only to the chastity and modesty expected of a noble woman, but also to virility, virtuosity, and her fertile mind. Mary Gerard has suggested that Sofonisba associated Virgo with the Latin virago or the Italian virtuosa. In early modern Italy, a virago or virtuosa was a woman who possessed a masculine virtuosity, making her exceptional and unique in comparison to other women. Such a reading becomes plausible when one considers that the artist deliberately covers the final two letters, engaging in visible enillage. By changing virgo into vir, she transforms the word from an explicit signifier of virginity into one of implied masculine accomplishment. Contemporary theology reinforced the connection between virginity, virtuosity, and virility by conflating virginitas with virilitas and virilitas. For Sophonisba's contemporaries, the most virile virgin was Mary. The artist strengthens her association with the Virgin with her reference to the speculo, harnessing the trope of Mary as an unspotted mirror. In the inscription, therefore, Sophonisba likens herself to the Virgin and her work to the fruits of Mary's womb. But instead of producing physical offspring, her art becomes her legacy. The association of Virgo with speculo also allows Sophonisba to position herself within a distinctly feminine tradition of virile artists. When considering the genre of self-portraiture in particular, the relationship between virginity, virility, and mirrors takes on additional meaning. In his famous Women, Boccaccio praises the first self-portraitist in history, the ancient Greek painter Marcia, for her chastity. Focusing specifically on a self-portrait painted with the aid of a mirror, he asserts that she is to be praised no less for her intellectual ability. Boccaccio characterizes Marcia as a virago or a virtuosa when he describes her intellectual capacity as literally ingenii viribus. By signing the Boston self-portrait as she does, therefore, Sophonisba lays claim to Marcia's chastity and agency, tacitly declaring that she is the 16th century embodiment of the classical artist. Unlike her male contemporaries, convention dictated that Sophonisba could not explicitly claim to surpass her classical precedents or audaciously demonstrate her intellectual and artistic prowess. Thus, the young artist conceals her meaning and transforms her self-promotion into an entertaining puzzle for her viewers. While the multivalent significance of the Boston self-portrait's inscription is evidence of Sophonisba's engagement with courtly gameplay, it emerges even more prominently in the central monogram. Upon close inspection, one can trace an A, N, G, U, or V, I, S, O, L, F, E, C, T, R, M, and a K. That last letter is particularly intriguing as K is not in the Italian alphabet. Now, scholars most often propose that the monogram is either a ciphered version of the Anguissola family motto, Anguissola fecit victoriam, or Sophonisba's father's name, Amilcare. But the fact that the letters for each are visible in the design complicates the assertion that one or the other is correct. In support of the motto, various authors suggest that the monogram's central placement recalls heraldic shields, which were often associated with displays of family nobility. By presenting a monogrammatic version of the motto, Sophonisba highlights her aristocratic lineage and augments visual signifiers of nobility, reinforcing her status as an exemplary noblewoman and artist, ideally positioned to enter a princely court. A reading of the monogram as her father's name, Amilcare, has a similar effect of strengthening her nobility, but through a more intimate connection. Sophonisba offers the tondo as a visual representation of her relationship with her father, foregrounding concepts of lineage and inheritance. She integrates his name into her monogram as an expression of gratitude for his unprecedented support of her career and to honor and perpetuate the family name. But neither the Anguissola motto nor Amilcare incorporate the K woven in with the other letters. Sheila Barker suggests that the K stands for Latin Carthago, Carthage. Now, ancient Carthage was of the utmost importance to the Anguissola family, who for generations had named their children after prominent Carthaginians. Sophonisba herself was named for the 3rd century BC noblewoman Sophonisba, and Amilcare likely ensured that his daughter knew her namesake's story. Moreover, the painter associates herself with her classical namesake, appropriating the heroine's positive characteristics as she does with Marcia in the Latin inscription. Her awareness of the historical figures for whom she and her family members were named allows the artist to further showcase her intellectual prowess, complementing her claims to and visual manifestations of nobility. Although scholars assert that there is a single correct reading of Sophonisba's monogram, its complexity suggests that there are multiple. The artist was intentional in her design, choosing words and imagery that conveyed a multivalent and layered meanings. The Boston self-portrait is an exercise in self-identification and encrypted messaging that demonstrates the painter's awareness of contemporary ludic trends and notions of courtly decorum. The young artist presents her audience with a painting that reads like an impresa, image and text working together to convey a unified meaning, or I suppose in this case, an infinite set of potential meanings. Drawing on their knowledge of literature and the artist, Sophonisba's courtly viewers would have understood her references to virtuosity and virility, classical precedents, artistic fecundity, and her noble heritage as a display of inherent worth. She unapologetically asserts her identity as an intellectual and refined noblewoman. But most importantly, Sophonisba illustrates, quite literally, that she's not like other girls. For what other bright young woman could paint as she does? Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Our next speaker is Dave Johnson, presenting the portrait of Bencino Brugnolaio and Diverse Things, genre blending in Giovanna Garzoni's Old Man from Artemino for a Medici Prince. Dave.
In 1648, portraitist, miniaturist, and still life painter Giovanna Garzoni was commissioned by Prince Don Lorenzo de' Medici to create The Old Man from Artemino, a sizable painting in tempera on parchment. The request by the prince was for a portrait of a certain Bencino Brugnolaio, together with many other objects, which resulted in a unique picture within Garzoni's repertoire and represents a rare example during the period of a painting that fused the artistic genres of portraiture, still life, and landscape painting. In the picture, Garzoni applied her characteristic precision to depict a resplendent array of items, including foodstuffs, a quirky Bracco hunting dog, domestic and wild birds, dead game, a straw basket brimming with eggs, a straw-covered flask, a delicate china bowl full of ricotta cheese, a large everyday chipped bowl of painted clay with a cut cantaloupe, and a smooth earthen jar all carefully arranged in a landscape setting. In the foreground, the terrain serves as a table for the bounty. To the left of the middle ground, a rocky outcrop rises skyward from a base of seemingly organized slabs and boulders. As a counterpoint, a mature bearded peasant appears on the right, donning a tall brimless woven hat. Only his torso appears before the mountainous landscape. Turned toward the terrain-is table, he cradles two live hens with his gaze directed to the viewer in a half-length portrait. A blue sky with supple clouds banking occupies the upper tier of the composition and crowns at its base a receding mountain range in a light, almost luminous shade. Rendered by Garzoni's brush with acute attention to the most minute aspect of each item, a buoyant synthesis emerges in a deliciously novel work. By the time of Don Lorenzo's commission for the painting, he had built an impressive art collection for his residence at the Medici Villa of La Petraia, located a short distance northwest of Florence. However, shortly after the commission, Don Lorenzo died, and the completed painting entered the collection of his nephew, Grand Duke Ferdinando II de' Medici, and his consort, Vittoria della Rovere, at the Medici Villa of Poggio Imperiale, south of the city center. The recent studies on Giovanna Garzoni's career by Sheila Barker and Anatole Chikhin's entry for The Old Man from Artemino in the catalog of the 2020 Garzoni exhibition in Florence provide exhaustive bibliographies of published references of the painting. Gerardo Casale's studies present insights into the commission and invoices and the scholarship of Evelina Barea and Ferdinando Chiostri have revealed Don Lorenzo's art collections and agricultural production at La Petraia. Alan Grieco has illuminated the social and political aspects of early modern food consumption. Collectively, this scholarship provides an opportunity to re-examine the painting and its significance for its patron and artist. The Old Man from Artemino, Garzoni's most eclectic work and the only one she ever produced of its kind, has never been contextualized in its originally intended setting at La Petraia, Don Lorenzo's primary residence and the home of his art collections. Today, I propose that the painting presents an ideal tableau with specific social meanings relevant to Don Lorenzo, and that the painting would have complemented other paintings at his villa. This inquiry begins with an overview of the documentation for the painting's commission and later provenance history, then focuses on La Petraia during Don Lorenzo's lifetime and his art collections there, and turns to the Old Man from Artemino, contextualizing it within Don Lorenzo's picture gallery. Finally, we will consider how the period beholder would have viewed items in the painting, suggesting that the ingenious blending of genres resulted from a collaboration between Don Lorenzo and Giovanna Garzoni, and that it represents a more extensive creative partnership between the Medici prince and his artist. The commission in 1648 by Don Lorenzo for the painting differed significantly from those by other patrons during Garzoni's career, which were typically for portraits or for still life paintings. The Accademia Nazionale di San Luca archives in Rome and the State Archives in Florence hold 4 critical documents concerning Don Lorenzo's request that scholars have uncovered that enable us to understand the circumstances of the painting's original commission, the invoice, the payment, and a later inventory. The first document, conserved in Rome, where Garzoni was living when she died, is from her own notebook. She records that Don Lorenzo presented her with a commission that reads, "His Most Serene Highness, Don Lorenzo, ordered from me a large sheet with diverse things and with the portrait of Bencino Brugnolaio." We have no further record regarding Don Lorenzo's request. On the 15th of November, 1648, shortly after this entry, Don Lorenzo suddenly died. Garzoni now had a commissioned painting, but had no patron to pay for it. She documents the painting a second time in 1649, recording an invoice she sent for the finished picture to Grand Duke Ferdinando II de' Medici, Don Lorenzo's nephew, describing the work as that piece with Bencino Brugnolaio and diverse things of much labor. Essentially, she was looking to be paid for the required effort. A third document, this one in Florence, penned by Duke Ferdinando II's secretary, corroborates Garzoni's note of the invoice. Dated the 8th of November, 1649, it notes, "Giovanna Garzoni presented a petition to your highness, Grand Duke Ferdinando II de' Medici, that she had completed several highly detailed works for Lord Prince Don Lorenzo without having received any compensation, and she begged of your highness to order that she be paid. The given proposal was 100 scudi." The fourth document should be considered in the likelihood that Ferdinando II paid Garzoni for the painting and then gifted it to his consort, Vittorio della Rovere, a collector of Garzoni's work. This record of the painting appears in an inventory of the Medici Villa of Poggio Imperiale from 1691, taken over 40 years after Don Lorenzo died and more than 20 years after Garzoni died. It assigns an attribution of origin for the man in the painting for the first time. The scribe records the work as a view of a mountainous landscape with the Old Man of Artemino. From that point forward, the Old Man from Artemino became the picture's title, which some scholars suggest sets the painting near the Villa Medici of Artemino, some 37 kilometers west of Florence. Other scholars have remarked that the landscape bears no resemblance to that area, and the debate is whether it depicts a specific or an imaginary place. It becomes evident that over time, the painting's originally intended context and the identity of its human subject became obscured. By reviewing Don Lorenzo's life at La Petraia, we can more profitably consider Garzoni's picture in association with other paintings in his collection there. By 1600, the year of Don Lorenzo's birth, La Petraia had developed into an agricultural estate for food production for the court and as hunting land. In 1609, he inherited the property. As the youngest son of Ferdinando I, he had very few court obligations. Don Lorenzo's life at the villa, which became his primary residence around 1620, provided him a role within the dynasty as the proprietor of a productive estate and afforded him space to build an art collection. By 1630, he had completed a redesign of his vineyards and built pergolas for his citrus trees. By 1640, he had a significant production of high-quality fruit and wine. In addition, his art collection was also evolving in a creative and original way. Although Don Lorenzo's villa has undergone modifications, his impact is still visible today. In 1636, he commissioned Il Volterrano to paint several walls of frescoes adorning the villa's central courtyard, depicting Medici pageantry. Heralding the family Medici legends, the immense work set the backdrop for Don Lorenzo's picture gallery. And after his death in a 1649 inventory of his collection at La Portraiture, his interest in genre-blended paintings is revealed. A typical example is by an obscure Tuscan painter, Giovanni Pini, in his 1633 Young Man with Food in the Open Air. A seated youth rests against a tree trunk with a plethora of still life objects in an open landscape setting. Factoring the prince's specific request that Garzoni create a portrait with numerous still life objects, and that after creating The Old Man from Artemino, such a painting never materialized in her work again, it is reasonable to affirm that the patron played a crucial role in the conception of these genre-blended works. Considering a few of the many diverse things in The Old Man from Artemino, we will also see that Garzoni's painting delivered a Tuscan buffet that spoke directly to Don Lorenzo's interest in ways that intended viewers would have recognized. First, the hunting dog. Garzoni depicts to the far left edge of the painting. The intelligent and good-natured Italian Bracco was a favorite breed of both the Medici and Gonzaga families. In a 1624 letter, the Duchess of Mantua, Caterina de' Medici, details sending her brother, Don Lorenzo, the most desirable gift of prized Bracci puppies. The Bracco, considered the oldest breed of pointer hunting dog in Europe, dates to the 4th century. Dante celebrated them in his Rime, Bracci bellowing and hunters howling. Don Lorenzo spent considerable financial resources raising his hunting dogs, and his inventories contain numerous firearms for hunting. Garzoni's Bracco in the painting leans into the frame and gazes wistfully with an inquisitive look, perhaps directly toward the beholder. At the front edge of Garzoni's stone table, she depicts tart cherries, an example of a fruit at the top of the great chain of being, a theory during the period that assigned a value structure to the natural world, including to all edible plants and animals. In this discussion, the hierarchy refers to social structure and diet. The cherries, which grew high off the ground, were regarded as food for the upper classes. The prized crop at La Portraiture is referenced in the surviving letters from 1638 between Monsignor Lodovico Incontri, the architect and art appraiser for Don Lorenzo, and Galileo Galilei, the astronomer and an early tutor for the prince. While residing with Don Lorenzo, Incontri sent Galileo 2 flasks of sour cherry wine from La Portraiture, demonstrating how gifts of such fruits from the Medici estate could serve as tokens of favor and prestige. In the center foreground of the painting are 2 hybrid citrons, known as Bizzaria, first produced in Florence in 1640. It was a hybrid version of the citrus that had arrived from Asia during the 9th century. This is one of the earliest paintings recorded of this new cultivar in Tuscany, which Garzoni renders from nature. By the end of the century, the Medici had devised a system to record and catalog the multitude of citrus varieties in their gardens. The delicate china bowl filled with ricotta cheese to the left of the center represents one of the highly sought foreign ceramics in the Medici collections, or a dish from the local Medici porcelain workshops established in the 1560s to bypass the import expense from the Far East. Either way, the depiction of serving soft cheese on Asian or Asian-inspired ceramics was fashionable among the elite. The painted clay serving bowl with a cut cantaloupe represents another example in the hierarchy of the chain of being. In this case, the melon, a ground dweller, is depicted in this rough, ordinary dish. signifying it as a lower status food in its corresponding container. The meticulously rendered fly on the melon showcases Garzoni's innovative use of Galileo's microscope, taking full advantage of the cutting-edge science and technology of her time. We have reviewed the available archival documents, considered the research in Renaissance food studies, and recontextualized Giovanna Garzoni's The Old Man from Artemino within its originally intended setting at Don Lorenzo's residence, the Medici Villa of La Petraia, focusing on how period beholders may have understood items in the painting and detailing how it aligns with typical examples in Don Lorenzo's art collection, reveals the prince as a creative, imaginative patron developing a collection of hybrid paintings at the time of his death, and that Giovanna Garzoni's extraordinary genre blending in a painting she identified in her own words as a portrait of Vincino Brunellesco and diverse things represents the apogee of an ambitious, ingenious partnership between a patron prince, Don Lorenzo de' Medici, and his artist. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Our last speaker is Hannah Ward, presenting Leonardo Pittore Razzista, How Italy's Fascist Government Appropriated Leonardo da Vinci as an Icon for Racial Propaganda in La Difesa della Razza. Hannah.
In 1918, the Italian fascist philosopher Giovanni Gentile stated, "One moment, history belongs to the past. The next moment, it belongs to the present." This quote summarized how the Italian government would soon use Italian history to enforce fascist principles during the 1930s and early 1940s. Italy's fascist government appropriated cultural history in their attempt to unify a racially pure Italy and to connect Italian citizens to a shared history and racial inheritance in adherence to fascist ideology. In this presentation, I will analyze how La Difesa della Razza, an Italian government-sponsored official racial journal published from 1938 to 1943, employed Leonardo da Vinci's biography and works of art to promote racial ideas of Italian superiority during the fascist period. The fascist government manipulated the figure of Leonardo to connect their present-day politics to eras rich in Italian history, such as the Renaissance, through this propaganda. The fascist government's Ministry of Popular Culture funded the bi-monthly publication of La Difesa della Razza. The journal was the mouthpiece for all Italian racial propaganda, and its publishers hoped to popularize their racial ideologies amongst the Italian public. The Racial Office distributed over 140,000 copies of each issue during its early years of publication, which later declined as the war continued. During the fascist period, racial ideology in Italy became a highly debated topic among Italian scholars in fields such as biology, anthropology, and psychology. Unlike Nazi Germany, where a more monolithic racial ideology emerged, Italy gave birth to various factions who disagreed on what being a racist truly meant. The three primary racial factions discussed within La Difesa della Razza were the racial biologists, the Mediterraneanists, and the spiritual racists. Racial biologists studied race using pseudoscientific research based on Darwinian theories that posited a racial hierarchy that positioned those of European descent as the superior race based on physical traits. Mediterraneanists argued that those with ancestry originating from the northern Mediterranean region were racially superior, thus specifically placing northern Italians as the superior race. Spiritual racism used history and myth to create and imagine racial spirit instead of focusing explicitly on aspects of race. La Difesa della Razza became a propaganda tool for an ambiguously defined Italian racism and a place where scholars could debate their factions' ideologies. Many of the journal's 118 issues used Italian history and culture to explain accepted racial ideologies in Italy.
The journal mentions 36 Italian Renaissance artists from Giotto to Michelangelo. After Giotto, Leonardo is the most frequently featured Renaissance artist in La Difesa della Razza. Giotto, the most mentioned, is included within multiple anti-Semitic articles in the publication. I chose to focus on Leonardo for this presentation because the articles he is included within cover a wider breadth of popular fascist topics of propaganda during this period of time. 9 articles specifically discuss or include art by Leonardo and connect his art, scientific studies, and biography to popular racial ideologies promoted by the fascist government. The government, particularly the Ministry of Popular Culture, chose Leonardo to symbolize the origins of the fascist new man concept. The new man concept arose in the early 20th century, along with the rise of right-wing fascist governments in Europe. The new man represented the culmination of the Italian race into strong and virile men. The new man did not necessarily signify strength through masculinity, but rather was somebody who embodied the country's great history, particularly in artistic and scientific pursuits. Leonardo, regarded as a national hero, served as a perfect precursor of the modern new man. One of Mussolini's top generals, Pietro Badoglio, praised the artist in the introduction to the Leonardo da Vinci exhibition catalog, published in 1939 for the major show on the artist in Milan. Within this description, he calls Leonardo a superhuman and a contributor to the current Italian people, which aligns with the new man narrative that the fascist government was attempting to present. In this presentation, I will focus on a selection of articles that either specifically discuss Leonardo or include his art without mention of the artist within the body of the text. I will examine La Difesa della Razza's employment of Leonardo to push popular racial topics such as Italian patrimony, racial science, and anti-Semitism. I will draw from primary source material and demonstrate how the authors in La Difesa della Razza incorporated Leonardo's art and biography into the broader realm of fascist propaganda and Italian racial theory. The first article, The Fable of Europeanism and the Italian Leonardo, indicates the fascist desire to demonstrate cultural patrimony over Leonardo's biography and art. Though the term cultural patrimony often refers to objects in most art historical contexts, the term can also include intangible phenomena, such as cultural heritage and history more broadly. This section uses the term to discuss the Italian effort to regain authority over Leonardo's legacy, which the author Giuseppe Pensabene, under the pen name dell'Isola, believed had been wrongly appropriated by foreign scholars. He asserted in the May 20th, 1939 issue of La Difesa della Razza that no one talks about the real Leonardo, the Italian Leonardo, since he believed that foreign scholars had appropriated Leonardo's myth for their own liberal agendas. According to the article, dell'Isola believed Leonardo had lost a crucial part of his biography, the part that remembered him being of the Italian race. Instead, he had become part of a common cause of theologians and liberal Enlightenment thinkers, regardless of his Italian origins. He called these understandings of Leonardo an erroneous thesis, which were the product of superficial examination by foreign scholars. dell'Isola blamed the French poet and philosopher Paul Valéry's famous 1894 essay, Introduction to the Method of Leonardo da Vinci, for proliferating incorrect translations of Leonardo's writings and misunderstandings of the artist's methods, which turned Leonardo into what dell'Isola believed to be the stereotype of the modern Enlightenment intellectual. He believed Valéry's mistaken model of Leonardo was the origin of all foreign models of the artist's biography. The article concludes with dell'Isola's assertion that the popularly presented Leonardo is always the European Leonardo, Valéry's Leonardo, and thus not the Italian Leonardo. The second group of articles I will discuss display Leonardo's scientific work in biology and engineering. Italian scholarship intensely focused on Leonardo as a scientist in both the pre-fascist and fascist periods. The focus on Leonardo's science came to its peak in 1939 at the Leonardo da Vinci exhibition in Milan, in which several buildings were focused on his inventions, engineering, and anatomical studies. The inventions section of the exhibition specifically included full-scale models of Leonardo's designs for war machinery, hydraulics, and other devices from the Codex Atlanticus.
Authors in La Difesa della Razza also promoted the fascist focus on Leonardo as a scientist and engineer. The fascist philosopher Julius Evola published the article Race and War, the Aryan Concept of Fighting, which juxtaposed images of Leonardo's drawings of weaponry in the Codex Atlanticus with modern Italian-made weapons to promote support for the imminent war approaching. Evola wrote that warfare is part of the peninsula's historic tradition in both antiquity and the Renaissance. Evola used Leonardo's war machine drawings as a direct link to Italy's violent history, presenting Leonardo as the precursing genius of modern warfare. Evola created the philosophy of spiritual racism, which used myth and history to create a unified race. Evola does not mention Leonardo within the body of this article, but chose his work specifically to display a connection between historical warfare and the approaching war he was advocating for. The biological racism faction also used Leonardo's drawings as historic examples in La Difesa della Razza in the December 1939 issue. This article showcased Leonardo's anatomical drawings, specifically those depicting facial and bodily proportions, such as the Vitruvian Man, as examples of how the artists used the same methods as modern anthropologists, thus tracing modern racial biological studies to Leonardo as a precursor. That La Difesa della Razza also presented Leonardo as a precursor of the modern racial scholar is apparent in the final article we will discuss today by Gino Sotochiesa, entitled Leonardo the Racist Painter, which asserts that Leonardo portrayed each apostle in Milan's Last Supper as racially perfect. Within this article, Sotochiesa included both detailed images of Leonardo's actual fresco in Milan and an image of the early 16th century reproduction in the Louvre by Marco di Gionio, a pupil of Leonardo's. Sotochiesa acknowledged that all the disciples were Jews since the Last Supper precedes Christ's imminent crucifixion. But Sotochiesa believed Leonardo separated the depiction of Judas from the rest because he bore the stigmata of his crime and his diabolical evilness. Similar to other Renaissance-era Last Supper images, Judas has a noticeably darker skin tone than the rest of the disciples, and he does not display the same surprised reaction to Jesus' prediction of his betrayal. Another article in La Difesa della Razza, published in 1941 by the fascist anthropologist Giovanni Mauro, titled Jewish Judas, further discusses the somatic features of Judas's countenance. Mauro, also studying Leonardo's Last Supper fresco, described Leonardo's depiction of Judas's somatic features as cold and grim, with a bony face, a large chin, a robust jaw, a low visor-like forehead with a conspicuous hooked nose. Mauro stated that these features made Judas look like a bird of prey and noticeably pithecoid or monkey-like. Mauro's description of Judas is similar to how popular anti-Semitic images portrayed the stereotypical Jewish male in both Italian and German propaganda of this period. The logo for La Difesa della Razza, which served as the cover of the publication's first two issues in August 1938, displays a similar stereotypical image in which we see a slashing sword that violently separates an ancient Roman statue from a stone relief believed to be depicting a Jewish man whose features correspond to those described by Mauro, along with an image of an African woman. One of the critical tenets La Difesa della Razza promoted was anti-Semitism and how the Jews were dangerously disguised amongst Christian Italians as converted Jews. To emphasize this conspiracy, the publication employed Leonardo's image of Judas seated amongst the other disciples to amplify this fear. La Difesa della Razza used this image to suggest that modern anti-Semitism was a logical outcome of historic Italian traditions rooted in periods such as the Renaissance. As demonstrated in this presentation, the fascist publication La Difesa della Razza manipulated Leonardo's biography and art to advance racial propaganda in Italy. These propaganda methods, often ahistorical and pseudoscientific, drew upon shared histories and cultural figures in an attempt to indoctrinate the Italian public. Leonardo became symbolic of Italy's history and assumed the role of a precursing icon of patrimony, science, and racism in modern Italy. My paper responds directly to Roger Crumb's concluding question: Will you dismiss or suppress the fascist afterlife as nothing more than a curious, if not altogether misguided, manipulation of an unrelated Renaissance object? The authors who wrote in La Difesa della Razza systematically drew upon the pseudoscience they supported in conjunction with Leonardo's artistic and scientific legacy to methodically manipulate history to promote a racist ideology. We cannot ignore this manipulation of Leonardo's work when studying the artist today. Rather, we must reflect upon the lasting consequences of the fascist appropriation of artwork and artists. Now, more than ever, we must continue evaluating Crumb's question. The recent victory of Giorgia Meloni from the far-right Brothers of Italy party in Italy's fall 2022 elections places the fascist past flush with an unsure future. Meloni revealed her party's plan to reinvigorate the Italian Renaissance in the Brothers of Italy's 2022 program in the section called Culture and Beauty, Our Renaissance, which will use arts and culture for a contemporary nationalist agenda. Meloni also praised the leadership of Giorgio Almirante, who was a frequent author in La Difesa della Razza with 23 published articles about anti-Semitism and anti-immigration laws, and was also the founder of the neo-fascist social movement after World War II. It is imperative that scholars today keep Crumb's question in mind as we continue observing the ever-changing histories informing an artwork's or an artist's life and afterlife. In conclusion, the fascist writers of La Difesa della Razza selectively picked historical information to fashion Leonardo into an imagined racial ideal. Leonardo became the fabricated precursor of the fascist new man, and his artistic and scientific work became weapons in the hands of the Italian fascist government. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. If I could ask our last four speakers to come up to the front of the room. You have heard another amazing display, if I might say, of the hard work that these young scholars have accomplished in their time in Florence and presented you the fruits of their labors. You all now have the chance to ask questions of Noah, Katie, Dave, or Hannah. And Jonathan will bring you the microphone. If you could again introduce yourself and make sure the microphone is picking up your voice so that the people watching remotely can also hear. Okay.
Hello, Thomas Galdi is my name. On the Parmigianino, I know this isn't absolutely specific to the purpose of your talk. During your talk, you talk as if you accept the attribution to Parmigianino. Is that the case, or can you tell us something about its actual attribution? Is it accepted?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that question. The attribution of the portrait, this is a question that I get into a little bit more in the body of the paper that's associated with this presentation. I think what I would accept is that that version of the painting that I showed in the talk certainly dates from the 16th century and represents Parmigianino's idea of the portrait. It matches the description that Vasari provides in the 1568 version of his lives. And then it also matches a description in Ercole Gonzaga's posthumous inventory from 1563 or 62, I think 63. And so thinking about the quality of the portrait in particular, I haven't viewed it in person, so I'm not necessarily great on the connoisseurial aspects. I think that because it's an allegorical portrait of a different type than a lot of the other portraits Parmigianino was producing, that could explain for some of the reasons I think it has a poorer quality than, say, if you go to the ones and see the portraits at the Uffizi. And there are also some unusual aspects of the painting. For instance, the topography of the globe it doesn't necessarily match, for instance, how accurate his globe is in a contemporary painting, The Madonna of the Rose in Dresden. But at the same time, an interesting aspect is that Vasari wrote that the jewel that Parmigiano refused to give it up because it was unfinished. And if you look in the portrait I showed, the jewels at the lower end are unfinished. And so perhaps another idea is perhaps Parmigiano designed the portrait and didn't paint it whatsoever. It was just taken up by his studio. So I think these are all possibilities. I'm not going to put like the idea that he did the portrait on my back, but.
Just continuing on the topic of attributions, Katie, I had a question for you. It's something which hasn't come up in our previous discussions. As you know, there's a lot of debate about the painting of Campi, painting Sofonisba, and in that painting, the hands play a certain role. And I was wondering, I was struck in your talk today by how much attention Sofonisba gives to the hands. I was wondering if you think that is something characteristic of her that might help indicate her authorship of this other painting, or just something about her use of hands within paintings that she does.
How fortuitous you should ask about that painting, because I recently read the conservation report and the cleaning is incredibly problematic. But in terms of hands in general, Sofonisba's self-portraits that date before her tenure at the Spanish court all have an emphasis on her hands. For instance, one of the self-portraits I briefly showed that's from 1554 in Vienna, she's holding a book and her fingers are positioned just so that she points at Virgo, in her signature on that. In the Bernardino Campi painting Sofonisba, which may or may not be an autograph painting, there are actually three hands. So there's one hand that was originally hidden behind Campi's painting arm, and then another hand hidden behind Campi's painting arm, and then another hand that is down here holding a glove. Now, the conservation report remarks that Sofonisba, or whoever the artist was themselves, had completely executed the hand that was behind Campi's painting hand and then covered it up and repainted the hand down here holding the glove. As to whether or not those hands can be used to categorically attribute the painting to Sofonisba, I do not have an answer. Iliasandra Perlinghieri, who wrote the first English language monograph on Sofonisba, believes that she has a certain type of hand that is also reflected in her sister's paintings. However, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I don't want to speculate further without supplementing my own knowledge, my own connoisseurial knowledge of her work.
Maybe I missed it. Did you mention a date of the painting and the age that she was in that?
Of the Boston one? Yes. So the commonly accepted date is 1556, which would make her around 26, I believe, depending on when you think she's born. I think 1532.
A question for Noah about Charles V and his role at Bologna. As we know, the coronation happened at the end of a long series of talks between the Pope and the Emperor that decides kind of easing their relations after the sack of Rome. Also had the goal to basically redraw or stabilize the geopolitical map of the peninsula. So, deciding who was going to rule where. So is this dimension of Charles as the pacificatore of Italy anywhere to be seen in this painting or in other portraits of Charles? Because personally, I think this was also a major feat it was seen as a major feat by the emperor to have ended in that way with the Pope the long series of the Guerra d'Italia that had been this kind of major disaster, that everybody had considered to be one of the most serious plights that Italians had ever faced. So is this anywhere to be seen here or elsewhere? Because I don't know much about the iconography of Charles V. Thank you.
Sure. So thinking about the role of how Charles's role as like kind of pacifier of the Italian peninsula is reflected in the portrait. I think it's part of my goal has been, I came to this portrait with the question, at the same time, almost, Titian painted 2 portraits of Charles V, both of which are now lost, but are preserved in copies and prints. And in both of those, he shows the emperor with his sword outstretched, which is kind of a much more kind of warmongering image of the emperor. And Parmigianino's image is completely different. So I think in terms of that, each artist kind of has their own image of their own political affiliation, so to speak, within this larger context of what was going on in Bologna. Conversely, there's a drawing by Sebastiano that shows kind of some of these talks happening where Charles is shown with a globe on the table, but Pope Clement VII is at the center of the drawing. And Charles looks rather unflattering in that portrayal. And so I think that, I certainly think that vision of Charles is incorporated within this larger portrait. But it's what's so interesting to me about it is the way that I think Parmigianino's design is looking at kind of the future. It's an image that promises something that is being achieved, will never be achieved, is expected to be achieved. And so how kind of his iconography encompasses all of those issues.
Hi, this question is for Hannah. I just want to ask about, so you talked, of course, extensively about Leonardo, but you mentioned Giotto. I wanted to just ask, do they use Giotto's work similarly? How does it sort of play off of Leonardo's work?
Yes, so within La Difesa della Razza, the top artists that are depicted most frequently are Giotto, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Titian. So I was choosing between Giotto and Leonardo for my capstone, actually. Giotto, he is only used within articles about anti-Semitism. And so usually because of his fresco of the betrayal of Jesus, where Judas kisses Jesus. And so that one pops up very frequently throughout La Difesa della Razza. And sometimes Giotto's mentioned, sometimes, like we saw in one of the covers that I showed, the Giotto's Judas is shown on that. So it's very frequently used throughout the publication. But Leonardo, I decided to choose Leonardo because he had like a wider breadth of different topics within fascist propaganda. So it was interesting because Leonardo is definitely being shown as a national symbol, whereas Giotto wasn't necessarily being shown as an artist, but just only for his one painting that worked well within anti-Semitic propaganda.
Okay. Again, my name is Jane Zaloga. And so thank you all 4 of you for really wonderful presentations. I thought those were all great. I have a question for Dave. I'm just kind of curious. That explanation of food is making me hungry. So thankfully, we're going to have lunch soon. But that figure is so prominent, and the artist identifies who he is. Do we know who he is? Do we know anything about him? You might have mentioned this and maybe I missed it at the beginning, but do we know who that gentleman is and what his significance is?
Yes. We are still exploring that. So after your drink today, we're all going to the Florentine archives. There's a big book of Don Lorenzo's for everyone to go through with me. So no, that's really, once this paper is to where it is in the next couple of days, I have explored that in Don Lorenzo's papers, but have not found it yet. My personal belief, and this is, off the record, is that I do think he's associated, the chances are he's associated with Don Lorenzo, wherever that is, a little closer. So we don't actually know. The short answer is we don't actually know from the scholarship that has been done who Bencino really is. But we're hopeful. So any ideas to help try to find that? And I'm very serious about this now. You don't have to go with me this afternoon, but if you have ideas, I'm all open for those suggestions. Thank you.
I have a question for Dave also. Andrew Rasmussen. The women superstars, painters of the early modern era that we're all familiar with, it includes Sophonisba and Artemisia. Can you talk just a little bit about lesser known artists like Giovanna, whom it would be great to refer to by her first name as well, and how they managed their careers, what kind of careers they had, how they were received in general? Thank you.
Yeah, I should just bring Katie up to talk about this because she's much more has much more scholarship on this than I do. But I would just say that to speak about Giovanna for a second, I do hope she will be a Madonna character too. And we're talking about the 20th century Madonna that we all know by the first name. She deserves that. She's an incredible artist, as we can see. I mean, she was taking it to new heights, and by using the convex mirror and the microscope, we can see what she was really able to achieve. I mean, these images are not even that high quality. So I hope if you haven't seen her work up close, that you will. I was able to see several of these pieces this year, thanks to our professors. I mean, my goodness, to see them up close was just, shocking, to be honest, at how incredible they are. She was well received in her period. She went around to all of the courts before this 1946 period when she comes back to work almost exclusively for the Medici at that point. She was a rock star already, really. I mean, she had been to all the courts, made quite a bit of money. And within just a few years after she left here, she goes back to Rome, where she moves into the Accademia Nazionale, where her papers are, and lived there the rest of her life, which was roughly about 20 years. And they sort of describe it. The scholarship describes it as that she's in retirement at that point. She doesn't even have to take, any more commissions if she doesn't want to. So she was well received in her period. I'm really saddened that we all didn't get to see that 2020 show, because I think it was, I'm sure some of you did. And if you did, you can tell us about it. But hopefully we will see more of those possibilities. And thank you for that question.
Could I ask the first three speakers to come up to the front of the room and join their colleagues in the cohort? If you have additional questions, you will have a chance to ask them during the reception. But before we depart the room to go to the reception, which will be on the other side of the wall behind our speakers, these 7 fine young scholars have now completed almost all of the requirements for the master's degree that they have been laboring so hard over the past 3 semesters. And so essentially, Professor Cornelison and Jonathan Nelson, who have been guiding them in their thesis research, would like to present them with a gift. And I hope you will join us in congratulating them. This is sort of their graduation ceremony. So if you could just remain seated, we're going to take a couple of pictures, and then when we're done, we'll all go and celebrate them. So this is for you. You want to forward the screen? It's okay. And you can go the other side. Thank you. Okay, well done. Please join us for a glass of Prosecco and some snacks to celebrate our young new masters.